Chapter 2080 Epic Rank Reward. Chapter 2080 Epic Rank Reward. An epic quest. Shifeng was slightly astonished when he heard the system notification. He had never heard of Horus giving out an epic quest in the past. He had only known that this NPC wanted Sea Tribe weapons in a bid for vengeance against the Sea Tribe. The quest in the past had only been an advanced hidden quest, requiring 1,000 Sea Tribe weapons to complete, and a player had to finish the quest before they could trade with Horus. Now, not only was the quest epic rank, but its completion also required 3,000 Sea Tribe weapons. This massive change ruined his plans. In the past, the activation quest had awarded the Ocean's Heart design, an intermediate magic array design. Although Ocean's Heart was only a barrier-type magic array, it could suppress sea monsters to a frightening extent. Ocean's Heart was even effective against mythic monsters and extremely useful to guilds trying to develop their naval prowess. The Ocean's Heart's magic array scrolls had sold for astronomical prices in the past. Of course, now that the quest had changed, its reward would be different as well. It seems I'll have to come up with a different method. Shifeng sighed deeply as he handed Horus 3,000 Sea Tribe weapons. The various major powers on the main continent had already reached a developmental bottleneck. As a result, these powers had begun to compete over the sea's resources. Fortunately, Zero Wing already had its own shipyard, many advanced speedboats, and control of several coastal towns and naval cities. Immortal Light, Zero Wing's subordinate, had also been developing its naval strength under Shifeng's orders and was now a significant power at sea. However, with how quickly the various major powers were developing, Zero Wing would struggle to maintain these advantages. Shifeng had wanted to rely on the Ocean's Heart to accelerate the guild's development at sea, but now, he had no choice but to look for other avenues. As Shifeng gave Horus the Sea Tribe weapons, the NPC's eyes glowed with excitement. Wonderful! There are indeed 3,000 Sea Tribe weapons here. Horus nodded in satisfaction, his hand abruptly flashing with a bright glow. When the light subsided, he held an ancient tome. I went to great lengths to obtain this book. Hopefully, you can make good use of it. If you obtain more Sea Tribe weapons in the future, you can find me to trade them. When Horus finished speaking, not only did Shifeng obtain the tome, but he also earned an abundance of EXP. Not only did he instantly level up from 71 to 72, but he also gained 2 additional legacy skill points from completing the quest. The quest rewards were incredible. It was much harder to level up after reaching level 70, and Shifeng's hidden class required twice as much EXP as normal players. An ancient forging book. Shifeng's eyes widened in shock when he inspected the book he had earned from Horus. Ocean's Heart didn't have much use to individual players, but the magic array was quite important to guilds. If possible, he wanted to trade 3,000 Sea Tribe weapons for the array design. However, after seeing the ancient forging book, this thought vanished. In God's domain, ancient forging books were akin to alchemy secret journals. Not only were they unique items, but the weapon or equipment designs they contained were also extraordinary. An ancient forging book was almost as valuable as an ordinary epic forging design. Shifeng immediately opened the ancient forging book, eager to discover what item it would help produce. Amazing! I struck gold this time. Shifeng could not help his growing elation as he read the tome's contents. The ancient forging book Horus had given him didn't contain one weapon or equipment piece design. Rather, it contained the designs to produce the dark gold set equipment, crystal light set. Although it was only a level 60 to level 80 set, it was an 8-piece set equipment, possessing more set effects than its 6-piece counterparts. If a level 60 player equipped the crystal light set, their combat power would be on par with a player wearing a 6-piece level 65 dark gold set equipment. At this stage of the game, the various superpowers could only dream of owning 6-piece level 65 dark gold set equipment. Anyone seen wearing such a set would even earn peak expert's envy. Of course, the crystal light set had harsh production requirements. At the very least, one needed to be a basic master forger to forge the set, and the required materials were extremely rare. For example, the set required a lot of fine titan ore, mana stones, and advanced magic cores, all of which were incredibly difficult to procure at this stage of the game, even for the various large guilds. However, material gathering was a secondary concern. The high production cost was far more important. If Shifeng calculated the cost according to current market prices, each production attempt would cost roughly 800 gold. Furthermore, a basic master forger wouldn't have more than a 30% success rate when trying to forge the set. Even intermediate master forgers would only have a 35% success rate, while advanced master forgers would have a 40% chance. Even if one were lucky, they'd still spend nearly 2,400 gold to produce one crystal light set. Although Zero Wing earned a lot of coins each day, most of those coins had to be spent on paying back debts. Shifeng still needed to pay back the astronomical construction cost for Silverwing Town's airport. Moreover, he had instructed Aqua Rose to invest funds into the Lost Town's development in secret to enable the guild to nurture more experts in a short time. In addition, Zero Wing had to fund Immortal Light's development and purchase epic materials for the upcoming auction house competition. Right now, the guild only had around 20,000 gold available for emergencies. If he wanted to mass-produce the crystal light set and form a personal security team like Nature Manifestations, he'd need a lot more coins. Thinking up to this point, Shifeng traded 1,200 Sea Tribe weapons and 1,500 elemental cores for 3 copies of the basic secret lore, Deep Sea Meditation. Shifeng could only return later to trade for Horus's remaining 3 copies. Deep Sea Meditation, Basic Secret Lore, allows the user to exhibit their body's latent potential through meditation, significantly improving their physique. This secret lore consumes a lot of stamina and concentration when used. Drops upon death. After purchasing the secret lore copies, Shifeng left to find the 4-star wandering merchant using the 7 luminaries ring. After teleporting 5 times, Shifeng arrived in a secret land. He then spent the next 4 hours clearing out the level 80+ monsters that stood in his way before locating a small, wooden house. A grey-robed, elderly man called Zol, one of 3 4-star wandering merchants in the Sea of Illusion, occupied the house. After meeting with Zol, Shifeng purchased all 500 stamina gemstones the NPC had, each gemstone costing 5 elemental cores. He couldn't have dreamed of doing something like this in his previous life. This NPC simply required too many elemental cores. If he hadn't obtained the 6,752 elemental cores while grinding in the ancient god's secret maze, he wouldn't have dared to purchase both the secret lore copies and the stamina gemstones. When the public had discovered Zol in the past, the various superpowers had monopolized the NPC's stock. These powers left very few gemstones for other players once they had finished with Zol. Hence, it was a dream for Shifeng to purchase 500 stamina gemstones in a single transaction now. The several players that had discovered Zol in the past had only purchased around 200 stamina gemstones. Even so, they had made a fortune, earning the various large guilds' envy. Following which, Shifeng took out a return scroll and teleported back to White River City. Chapter 2081, Stormy Winds. Chapter 2081, Stormy Winds. Starmoon Kingdom, White River City. Although White River City was not the kingdom's capital, its popularity overshadowed Starmoon City as the main headquarters of the kingdom's #1 guild and home to the Candlelight trading firm, which continued to introduce one new product after another. At this point, White River City had become the kingdom's capital in the hearts of Starmoon Kingdom's players. Since White River City was the only city in the kingdom to be promoted, its fame had reached new heights. Tons of players from foreign cities and countries visited the city every day, and it had become almost as prosperous as an ordinary empire's imperial capital. Over a dozen level 64 players in gorgeous equipment had gathered on the 2nd floor of White River City's auction house. They all wore the same guild emblem as they watched the fight in the auction arena. Contempt filled their eyes as they looked down on the combatants. As expected of a small kingdom. Although the local players' equipment standards are quite good, their combat standards are terrible. They're not even a match for some second-rate guilds in our Dark Knight Empire. It's no wonder why Zero Wing lords over Starmoon Kingdom, a level 64 berserker said as he watched several guild players from Starmoon Kingdom fight in the auction arena in ridicule. The berserker had not held back his opinion. With the physique of Tier 2 players, The combatants had heard him clearly even from 50 yards away. However, none of those players dared to comment against the berserker. They all simply lowered their heads and remained silent. This berserker had earned the right to such arrogance. This level 64 berserker had won 20 matches in the auction arena in a row. Quite a few of the berserker's opponents had been peak experts from Star Moon Kingdom, but none of them had dropped the berserker's HP below 80%. This berserker had even fought 2 opponents at once and still maintained his HP above 80%, winning the match. Moreover, the berserker's identity was extraordinary. This berserker was Dust Blood, one of the 10 great experts from the Dark Knight Empire's Bloodbath family. The Bloodbath family was a veteran first-rate guild, and at this point, it was the strongest guild in the Dark Knight Empire, excluding the 3 resident superpowers. The Bloodbath family also occupied a medium-sized kingdom and a small-sized kingdom. No ordinary first-rate guild could hope to compare to its strength. Although these guilds are very weak, Zero Wing's title as Star Moon Kingdom's overlord proves that it has some ability. Furthermore, Zero Wing has 4 experts that rank on the God's Domain experts list. Black Flame, in particular, has killed many superpowers peak experts thus far, a young man in dark grey robes said. Zero Wing's name had already become commonplace in the Dark Knight Empire. After all, the guild had successfully helped the 100 Flowers Palace stop Starlink's invasion in Moon Creek Town. The incident had surprised the Empire's various guilds, all of which had immediately investigated Zero Wing. However, the more they looked into Zero Wing, the more the guild surprised them. These guilds hadn't been surprised by Zero Wing's rapid development in God's Domain, but by the number of frightening powers Zero Wing had provoked. The Dragon Phoenix Pavilion's 9 Dragons Emperor, the Evil God's Temple, Pantheon, Blackwater, Miracle, and the Dark Knight Empire's Starlink. All of these guilds were powerful enough to make even a first-rate guild like Bloodbath family shudder in fear, yet Zero Wing had provoked every one of them. The fact that Zero Wing had survived this long was unbelievable. Calling it a miracle wasn't an exaggeration. Zero Wing's success will soon reach its end. The various superpowers have been busy with their own matters, so none of them have bothered to retaliate. I've also heard that Zero Wing has a tentative alliance with the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion's Phoenix Rain. But things have changed. The various superpowers have set their sights on White River City, and even if Phoenix Rain makes a personal appearance, she can't change Zero Wing's fate, Dust Blood said, sneering. The fact that Zero Wing had 4 experts that ranked on the God's Domain experts list was impressive to other guilds, but the achievement meant nothing to the various superpowers. The God's Domain experts list focused on players' battle records, not their overall strength. God's Domain had many experts that hadn't accumulated eye-catching battle records, yet wielded peerless strength. Take the Bloodbath family, for example. Bloodbath family's expert members were even stronger than the Refinement Realm experts on the God's Domain experts list, but none of them had actually made it on the list. To put it simply, only small guilds and independent players took the God's Domain experts list seriously. It was merely an information source for true major powers, not an indicator of a guild's strength. Moreover, the competition for an NPC city's auction house didn't rely on war weapons or tools. Instead, it relied on a guild's resources and experts. The competition prohibited artificial strength, so the war weapons Zero Wing had been lucky enough to acquire would be useless. With how few experts Zero Wing possessed, it wouldn't even be able to defeat veteran first-rate guilds like Bloodbath family, much less the various superpowers. I guess you're right. The various superpowers will not give up on White River City's auction house. Some of the old monsters that usually hide in the shadows are even revealing themselves to ensure their guild's success in the competition. Even experts on the God's Domain experts list will be of limited use, the young man nodded in agreement. When he spoke of the various superpowers' old monsters, fear and yearning flashed in his eyes. Thus far, the fights between God's Domain superpowers had been nothing more than skirmishes. Large-scale battles between these major powers were rare. Moreover, to nurture the younger generation, the various superpowers' true experts typically avoided their guild's affairs. They kept to themselves, quietly increasing their strength. If these old monsters took action, how would the younger generation acquire any fame? Even the younger generation's greatest prodigy was a joke before these old monsters. Zero Wing is certainly unlucky. It could have remained the king of its mountain for some time. Unfortunately, White River City was promoted too quickly. Now, even its dream of standing atop its mountain as king would shatter. I've heard that even King's Return, Blackwater, and Pantheon have arrived to compete for White River City. I can't wait to see these superpowers tear Zero Wing apart, Dustblood said, smiling. Oh, look over there. Even the Glory Empire's holy reincarnation has come. It seems that they're here to watch the fight between these superpowers, as well, the young man said suddenly as he pointed to a group of 10 or so players that had just arrived in the second-floor hall with a smirk. Holy Reincarnation was also a veteran first-rate guild, strong enough to rival the Bloodbath family. It was also the second strongest guild, after King's Return, in the Glory Empire. While the various kingdoms and empires' powers gathered in White River City in anticipation of the auction house's struggle, Shifeng worked on crafting the crystal light set in the nearby candlelight trading firm. Although up to 10 players could learn the crystal light set's production method from the ancient forging book, it was an 8-piece dark gold set equipment. Not even basic master forgers like Melancholic Smile and Cream Cocoa would have much success with forging the set. Furthermore, Melancholic Smile and the others had their own work to focus on. Hence, Shifeng decided to craft the set equipment himself. Fortunately, acquiring the required materials was no trouble for Shifeng. Zero Wing had been growing stronger as time passed, and as a result, it had compiled a ton of materials in the guild warehouse. In addition, the candlelight trading firm had joined the secret chamber of commerce. So, obtaining the necessary materials to forge the crystal light set equipment was quite easy for the guild. In fact, Shifeng had gathered more than a dozen sets of materials in less than an hour. He then refined the materials with the soul fire. Using the Philosopher's Hand's ability, Shifeng continued to shape one set piece after another. Before he put the finishing touches on the 8-piece set, Shifeng retrieved 40 grains of temporal sand. Temporal sand was incredibly valuable, with each grain selling for more than 20 gold on the market. Not only could it increase one's production success rate, but it could also strengthen the crafted item. Shifeng allocated 5 grains of temporal sand for each set piece, the maximum amount dark gold equipment could handle. If he hadn't had the Bracelet of Time, he wouldn't have dared to use the temporal sand so extravagantly. The crystal light set equipment then radiated a dazzling glow, illuminating the entire room. As the light faded, it revealed 8 pieces of equipment, glowing with a sparkling light and radiating an ancient, violent aura. Chapter 2082, Timeless Equipment. Chapter 2082, Timeless Equipment. Did it succeed? Shifeng could not help but grow a little excited as he gazed at the 8-piece set equipment on the table before him. Although he had more than 10 sets of materials on hand, the crystal light set was top-tier dark gold set equipment, its production difficulty only second to epic equipment. Although he had already become an intermediate master forger and with the help of the Philosopher's Hand, performed as an advanced master forger, successfully forging the crystal light set was incredibly difficult. Theoretical success rate, after all, had nothing to do with the actual forging process. In the game's early stages, the main god system had simplified the various production processes to their base limits to allow players to familiarize themselves with god's domain subclasses. However, as players reached higher levels and adapted, the main god system would gradually withdraw its assistance, and the various production processes would become more complex and detailed. Meanwhile, successfully forging a dark gold set equipment was a massive threshold for lifestyle players. During God's Domain's ancient times, weapons and equipment had only fallen into 2 categories, ordinary and extraordinary. More categories had only been added after the ancient gods had fallen. Ordinary equipment split into bronze, mysterious iron, secret silver, fine gold, and dark gold ranks. Extraordinary equipment had been broken down into epic and legendary. Dark gold weapons and equipment were considered the peak of ordinary equipment, hence, they were extremely difficult to obtain and produce. Without a larger power's support, an ordinary expert player would be limited to dark gold weapons and equipment at best. Meanwhile, dark gold set equipment was at the very apex of ordinary equipment, the best available without any flaws. No matter how high one raised their theoretical production success rate, a single mistake would result in failure. There was no room for error when crafting dark gold set equipment. One could argue that crafting dark gold set equipment was even more difficult than producing epic items, since the latter allowed for some mistakes. Only, the theoretical production success rate was much lower compared to dark gold set equipment. As Shifeng began to inspect the crystal light set before him, the sound of a system notification reached his ears. System: crystal light set has been successfully forged. Forging proficiency increased by 200 points. Obtained 10 million EXP. As expected of an 8-piece, dark gold set equipment. It provided so much proficiency. Shifeng was elated when he saw the system notification. Even forging ordinary dark gold weapons and equipment awarded very little proficiency after reaching intermediate master rank. Normally, he'd be lucky to get 3 points for each success. This was why a player needed so much time to rise to advanced master rank after becoming an intermediate master. Now, forging a single crystal light set awarded 200 proficiency points, the equivalent of crafting nearly 70 pieces of dark gold equipment. However, the crystal light set's attributes were the true reason for Shifeng's joy, not the system's reward. The crystal light set was a top-tier dark gold set equipment, and due to the enhancement the temporal sand provided, the 8 pieces' basic attributes had risen by 10%. Purely comparing basic attributes, ordinary epic equipment had around 20% to 30% higher attributes than the normal crystal light set, but the temporal sand had reduced that by 10%. There was no doubt that the set equipment before him was currently the best ordinary equipment available in the game. If he hadn't been wearing several pieces of epic equipment with beneficial effects, Shifeng would have immediately replaced his items with the crystal light set. Of course, Shifeng didn't stop after this success. He immediately began to forge the next set. As time continued to flow, the day of the auction house's struggle had finally arrived. White River City was particularly lively. Today, the various powers would battle to determine their future territories. As a result, countless players from Star Moon Kingdom and its neighbors had gathered in White River City. At this point, the city's player population exceeded 50 million. If not for White River City's traffic restriction, there would have been several times more players in the city. Today, even the various large guilds' elusive upper echelons gathered in the city's auction house. Representatives from more than 2,000 different guilds had come to participate in the competition. Moreover, a large number of adventurer teams and dark powers had arrived to participate in the day's events. With so many powers, ordinary players didn't even qualify to walk into the auction house and were barred from entering the building. The city's independent players watched the various major powers members enter the auction house in envy. For today only, players needed to carry at least one epic material to enter White River City's auction house. Otherwise, regardless of how powerful or wealthy one was, they wouldn't get past the doors and were forced to wait outside. Even so, a large crowd had gathered outside the building to watch the competition. These players hadn't gathered because they had nothing better to do, but because the system had set up several colossal magic mirrors to broadcast the events along the business district. Anyone on the streets or resting in one of the city's establishments would be able to watch the spectacular competition for dominance over the auction house. Meanwhile, 2 players, one old and the other young, sat in one of the auction house's top-floor VIP rooms. From this spectator's room, these 2 would have a full view of the auction arena below, which easily accommodated more than 100,000 players. If the various large guilds' upper echelons saw that only 2 people occupied this spacious VIP room, they'd curse them for being wasteful. Renting the auction house's top-floor VIP rooms cost 5 epic materials. Although epic materials were not as valuable as epic weapons or equipment, they were still extremely difficult to obtain. First-rate guilds would be fortunate to collect several dozen epic materials, and none of them would dare to spend 5 epic items just for a better view of the auction arena. Amazing. A city like White River City has actually attracted so many superpowers. Mu Lingshaw, the VIP room's younger occupant, exclaimed as she watched the various participating superpowers enter the arena. Starlink, Blackwater, Pantheon, and King's Return weren't the only superpowers present. Members of the Secret Pavilion, Sacred Temple, and Crimson Emperor had also come to participate. It's only natural. Although Starmoon Kingdom is only a medium-sized kingdom, an NPC city's auction house is incredibly important. If they can claim this city's auction house, they can earn a stable income. Moreover, Starmoon Kingdom has a gold mine like the Witch's Hill. With so many benefits up for grabs, it is only natural that many superpowers have been tempted into action, the elderly man beside Mu Lingshaw explained, smiling. If Crimson Emperor or Starlink's upper echelons saw this elder, they'd likely be astonished. This elderly man was Unknown King, Unyielding Soul's previous guild leader. When he had run the guild, it had risen to glory, but due to his age and his body's deterioration, he had retired from the front lines more than 2 decades ago. Grandpa, does Zero Wing really have no hope of holding White River City? Mu Lingshaw could not help but ask. She was grateful to Zero Wing for all the help it had provided thus far. Moreover, her good friend, Aqua Rose, was a member of the guild. If another power stole White River City, which served as Zero Wing's main headquarters, Zero Wing would suffer for it. None. Even if our guild lends Zero Wing a hand, I'm afraid that holding White River City would still be impossible, Unknown King said, shaking his head. Not even our help could change the situation? Mu Lingshaw was surprised. Although Unyielding Soul had been declining, it was still a veteran first-rate guild. Ordinary first-rate guilds still were no match for its strength. You're severely underestimating the participating superpowers. Although we are a superpower as well, their backgrounds and foundations are many times stronger than Unyielding Souls. Any other time, they might have backed off out of respect for our guild, but this competition will determine their future in God's domain. None of them will show respect for the others. Furthermore, Zero Wing has provoked too many superpowers, pushing them to the limits of their tempers. Now, nobody can save Zero Wing, Unknown King said, sighing. Mu Lingshaw lowered her head in disappointment. While the various major powers entered the auction house and eagerly awaited the competition's start, a group of players wearing 6-winged emblems entered the arena. The leader of this group was none other than Shifeng. Chapter 2083, Grand Gathering. Chapter 2083, Grand Gathering. When Zero Wing's members arrived, the atmosphere in the auction arena changed immediately. The various major powers' representatives couldn't help but shift their gazes to Zero Wing's players. Not only was Zero Wing Starmoon Kingdom's overlord, but its main headquarters was also located in White River City. Moreover, it had amazing growth potential and a very high chance of becoming a super first-rate guild in the future. To put it simply, the guild was in its heyday. If Zero Wing secured the management rights to White River City's auction house, not only would it solidify its position as the kingdom's overlord, but it would also have a stable source of income, further increasing its chances of becoming a superpower. However, rather than envying Zero Wing's players, the various major powers members only watched them with pity or delight. They actually dared to show up. Dust Blood, who stood outside of the arena, sneered when he saw Zero Wing's members. Do they really think that they can secure this auction house just because their headquarters is located here? Zero Wing had only dispatched a little over 100 players to the auction arena. It was a significant number compared to the various large guilds, who had only sent around 30 players each. In fact, the size of its group was only second to the various participating superpowers. However, most of the large guilds attending the competition were only there to spectate. They didn't actually plan to compete, so they hadn't needed to send a lot of members. The fact that Zero Wing had sent so many players proved its intentions. The guild would be participating in the competition. Although Zero Wing was Starmoon Kingdom's overlord, the Bloodbath family simply considered the guild a mere mountain king. It wasn't an issue if Zero Wing strutted around its kingdom normally. However, even the Bloodbath family had only sent around 40 players to such a grand event to gain experience, yet Zero Wing had dispatched more than 100 players to try to win this competition. Zero Wing simply overestimated itself. Maybe Zero Wing is putting up a final fight for its survival, the grey-robed young man said, sighing. After all was said and done, White River City was Zero Wing's main headquarters. If another power claimed the city's auction house, Zero Wing would lose the foundation it had spent so much time to build. The loss would be unimaginably dire for the guild. The competition for dominance in God's domain grew more intense as time passed. If a guild failed to keep up with the changing times, the gap between it and others would only grow. Losing one's main headquarters during these rapidly changing times would be fatal, especially for a new guild like Zero Wing. Its members had yet to acquire a sense of belonging and cohesiveness with how recently the guild had been established, and it wouldn't be surprising to see Zero Wing disband shortly after losing White River City. Unfortunately, everything weaker than the various superpowers was nothing more than an ant. This was the case true for a top-ranked first-rate guild like the Bloodbath family. At one time, the Bloodbath family had been recognized as a pseudo-super first-rate guild, but it was still no match for Starlink, Unyielding Soul, and Crimson Emperor in the Dark Knight Empire. The Bloodbath family was also wise enough not to harbor thoughts of antagonizing these three superpowers. In the virtual gaming world, unless one was on the brink of becoming a superpower, they couldn't truly understand what a superpower was. To the various guilds and players in God's domain, superpowers were, at most, guilds with greater financial strength and more experts than their weaker companions. Most didn't understand that the difference between a superpower and an ordinary power didn't lay in quantity, but in quality. Otherwise, the Bloodbath family would have become a super first-rate guild long ago, rather than the pseudo-super first-rate guild it was after so many years of development. Several dozen players in level 60 fine gold and dark gold equipment stood some distance away from the Bloodbath family group. These several dozen players radiated such intense killing intent as they watched Zero Wing's members that other guild experts around them kept their distance. However, the other experts weren't afraid of these layers because of the dense killing intent they radiated. Instead, they were wary because those players wore Sin Realm's guild emblem. Sin Realm was the Purple Thorns Kingdom's absolute overlord. Unlike Zero Wing, which only controlled a little more than a dozen major NPC cities in Star Moon Kingdom, Sin Realm controlled every NPC city in the Purple Thorns Kingdom. Ordinary guilds couldn't afford to provoke it. To think that even you would have such a day, Zero Wing, Skyview, Warring Empire's former guild leader, said gleefully, a hint of madness flashing in his eyes as he watched Shifeng's group. After Zero Wing had destroyed Golden Flow Town, the Warring Empire had perished in Star Moon Kingdom. In the end, he had no choice but to migrate to the Purple Thorns Kingdom and join Sin Realm with some of his trusted subordinates. He had instantly fallen from a guild's leader to an ordinary elder. He hated Zero Wing deeply for this. Unfortunately, he hadn't had any opportunities for revenge against the guild since Zero Wing was so powerful, especially with its war weapons. Even the various superpowers likely had headaches when dealing with Zero Wing's arsenal, much less a former guild leader. Fortunately, the heavens would not forsake the faithful. After such a long wait, he finally had the chance to watch the moment Zero Wing fell from its throne. Zero Wing has gotten too full of itself after acquiring its powerful war weapons and blatantly proving superpowers left and right. The guild is too young. Now that the situation in God's domain has changed, Zero Wing can only blame itself for its downfall. Lone Beacon, who sat beside Skyview, calmly commented. One should never casually provoke a superpower. Take Sin Realm, for example. Despite so many experts and support from powerful corporations, Sin Realm only dared to call itself overlord in its own kingdom. It actively avoided superpowers territories. However, Zero Wing repeated provoked superpowers even with no backing. Even Lone Beacon admired the guild's courage. However, regardless of Zero Wing's powerful war weapons, White River City would have a new owner today. While the various major powers discussed Zero Wing, a group of players entered the auction arena, causing a massive uproar. What? Even Nature Hall's members have come. Everyone was surprised to see Nature Hall's members in the arena. Nature Hall was one of the fastest-growing superpowers in God's domain. Not only did it control the Storm Empire, but it also had close relations with several powerful top adventurer teams in the game. Although these top adventurer teams weren't as large as superpowers, they had extraordinarily strong experts. It was rumored that some of these experts could even rival super first-rate guilds and super guilds' peak experts, with some even rivaling superpowers' old monsters. Hence, Even the various superpowers avoided provoking Nature Hall right now. The Storm Empire is so far away from Starmoon Kingdom. Logically, there's no reason for Nature Hall to contest for White River City. Could it be here because of the issue with Twilight Echo? That's most likely the case. Otherwise, Nature Hall wouldn't have sent Deep Thunder, its first vice-guild leader. Furthermore, no one knows what Zero Wing did to convince Nature Hall to give up on Twilight Echo, and because of this, Nature Hall has been humiliated in the Storm Empire. Zero Wing is definitely dead now. It had already provoked Blackwater and Starlink, and now, even Nature Hall has shown up. After today, Zero Wing will have no place in White River City. As everyone discussed Nature Hall's presence, they agreed that Zero Wing was truly doomed. Even other superpowers would suffer if they had to face 3 rising superpowers like Blackwater, Starlink, and Nature Hall, not to mention Zero Wing. Meanwhile, when Mu Lingshaw saw Nature Hall's members from her top-floor VIP room, her expression turned grim. It's over. It's really over. Blackwater, Starlink, and Nature Hall. Every one of these guilds was stronger than Unyielding Soul. Not even her guild would casually provoke any of these 3 superpowers, yet Zero Wing had angered all of them. All of Zero Wing's enemies smiled joyfully, especially Skyview and Shadowlight Axe, the former guild leaders of Warring Empire and Knight's Judgment. Meanwhile, after arriving, Deep Thunder and his team headed toward Zero Wing's members. But as everyone expected a fight to break out. Guild leader Black Flame, after such a short time apart, it seems that you've grown stronger yet again, Deep Thunder said amicably as he approached Shafong. Our guild leader has sent me with a specific order to help Zero Wing in this competition. If you encounter any trouble, please feel free to use my team and me as you see fit. Please send my gratitude to guild leader Nature. Zero Wing will remember this kindness, Shafong said, nodding. He realized that Nature Hall was trying to befriend his guild. Not at all. It's a small matter. When Deep Thunder heard Shafong's reply, he grinned with greater delight, recognizing that Shafong had accepted Nature Hall's attempt to form a friendship with Zero Wing. When the various major powers representatives saw this, their jaws dropped in shock. Chapter 2084, There's More Than One Backer? Chapter 2084, There's More Than One Backer? What's going on? Isn't Nature Hall here to cause trouble for Zero Wing? Deep Thunder's behavior stupefied the various major powers. They could not understand what Nature Hall was trying to pull. Are those people using disguises? The Bloodbath family's Dust Blood muttered in confusion. Nature Hall had already grown stronger than super first-rate guilds like the Dragon Phoenix Pavilion and Unyielding Soul. Such a powerful guild should disdain ordinary super first-rate guilds, let alone Zero Wing. However, after watching the exchange between Shafong and Deep Thunder, one would think that Zero Wing was the true superpower, not Nature Hall. No matter how Dust Blood considered the situation, he couldn't understand what was happening. I've met Deep Thunder personally. Although God's domain has many tools that can disguise a player, they can't replicate a target's strength and aura, the grey-robed young man said, shaking his head. That Deep Thunder looks and feels exactly like the one I've met. Moreover, Deep Thunder wields the Magic Warrior hidden class. You can feel a special kind of mana around him at all times. No tool can duplicate that feeling. Then, why is that Deep Thunder treating Black Flame so graciously? Dust Blood asked, clearly confused. I don't know. Maybe Nature Hall has some secret deal with Black Flame, the young man said. He was just as confused and didn't know how to answer his companion's question. With Nature Hall's strength and development speed, not even the secret pavilion would be able to stop it from targeting Zero Wing without tremendous compensation. The grey-robed young man had no idea what ability Zero Wing possessed to warrant Nature Hall's goodwill. Moreover, Nature Hall seemed to be desperate for Zero Wing's approval. The only explanation he could think of involved some private deal between Black Flame and Nature Hall's core upper echelons, convincing the larger guild to give up on Twilight Echo and support Zero Wing. No wonder why Zero Wing's members seem so fearless. It turns out they actually have Nature Hall's support, Dust Blood said, sneering. However, a trace of envy and admiration could be seen in his gaze. Although the Bloodbath family was a top-ranked first-rate guild and only a short distance from becoming an actual superpower, it could not afford to provoke some of the small guilds in its territory. Most of those small guilds were backed by superpowers. Even if Zero Wing lost White River City today, it could slowly recuperate its strength. It still wasn't an existence that ordinary powers could afford to provoke. As for Black Flame's private deal with Nature Hall, this was likely the case. After all, Black Flame possessed extraordinary individual strength. It wasn't surprising to find someone so powerful connected to certain influential individuals. In fact, the more Dustblood thought about it, the more it seemed plausible. It certainly explained why Zero Wing dared to provoke Blackwater and Starlink openly. Dustblood wasn't the only one with such thoughts. The various major powers' upper echelons had reached the same conclusion. One should not underestimate Nature Hall just because its territory was smaller than Blackwater and Starlink's. Nature Hall's Storm Empire was an ore country, far more valuable than the Steel Empire or Dark Knight Empire. Nature Hall had no reason to fear Blackwater or Starlink. Meanwhile, in another corner, Sin Realm's members were silent. The killing intent they radiated had also lessened. None of them had thought that Zero Wing had any backers, but in truth, it seemed that a titan stood behind the smaller guild. With Nature Hall's assistance, Zero Wing might actually hold White River City and solidify its position as Star Moon Kingdom's overlord. Zero Wing has an alliance with Nature Hall? Glaring hatefully at Shifeng, Skyview hissed, so what if you have Nature Hall's support? Nature Hall might not fear Blackwater and Starlink, but it is only one superpower. There are more than two superpowers for White River City. I refuse to believe Nature Hall can defeat them all. Sin Realm's members nodded in agreement. This competition for the auction house was unique, and even if Nature Hall helped Zero Wing defeat the participating superpowers, there were others in God's domain. Zero Wing would not change its fate of losing White River City. However, while the crowd discussed the relationship between Nature Hall and Zero Wing, two players, one young and one old, approached Shifeng. These two were none other than Mu Lingshaw and Unknown King. Guild leader Black Flame, I am Mu Cheng. My granddaughter, Lingshaw, has recently been in your care. If Zero Wing encounters any trouble, please feel free to request my help. Although I have withdrawn from the front lines, I dare say that I am still a capable fighter, Unknown King said, chuckling as he glanced at the various major powers in the auction arena. Sin Realm and the other superpowers that were so eager to watch Zero Wing's downfall were stupefied after watching Mu Cheng and Mu Lingshaw speak with Shifeng. What? Why is Thousand Hands doing here? What relationship does Zero Wing have with Unyielding Soul to warrant a personal visit from its former guild leader? The auction arena stirred at Mu Cheng's appearance. The various major powers weren't the only ones surprised by this old man's arrival. Many independent players were just as shocked to see Mu Cheng. Mu Cheng was one of the older generation's experts. He had been a big shot in the virtual gaming world when Unyielding Soul had been at its peak, and when he had still been active, everyone had known his nickname, Thousand Hands. He had been known as one of the top 3 assassins in the virtual gaming world. If his physical deterioration hadn't forced him away from the front lines, Unyielding Soul wouldn't have fallen to its current state. Why wouldn't everyone be shocked to see such a big shot greet Zero Wing and offer its help? Deep Thunder, who stood a short distance away, was also surprised to see this old man. He hadn't considered that Zero Wing would have such deep ties to Unyielding Soul, so much so that Unyielding Soul's former guild leader would make a personal appearance. Deep Thunder immediately raised his evaluation of Zero Wing. Who is this Black Flame? 2 superpowers have actually shown up to support him. Dustblood's eyes nearly fell from their sockets when he saw Mu Cheng talk to Shifeng. Although Mu Cheng had retired and was no longer at his peak strength, he could display a significant portion of his abilities with the latest virtual reality technology in God's domain. He definitely shouldn't be underestimated. If Mu Cheng really lent Zero Wing a helping hand, the outcome of this competition would be uncertain. Damn it. Why? This has to be a trick. Skyview was utterly flabbergasted. First, Nature Hall had offered its support, and now, so did Unyielding Soul. He simply couldn't keep up. Unlike the players in the auction arena, the The spectating crowd outside grew excited with the sudden development. No one had believed that Zero Wing had any backers, and despite its hopes of becoming a super first-rate guild, its chances were actually quite slim. However, they now realized that they had been mistaken. Not only did Zero Wing have 2 backers, but both were also true superpowers. Factoring in Zero Wing's development speed, the likelihood of it becoming a super first-rate guild was extremely high. Nature Hall and Unyielding Soul? Galaxy Past, who sat in one of the spectator rooms on the 2nd floor, couldn't help his bitter smile as he watched Deep Thunder and Mu Cheng. He had thought that Star Alliance had significantly shortened the gap between it and Zero Wing. He hadn't expected that Zero Wing had hidden so much power. He had watched Zero Wing grow from nothing, and he had assumed that he had seen everything the guild had to offer. Unfortunately, it seemed that he still underestimated Zero Wing's strength. Meanwhile, Purple Eye watched Aqua Rose and Gentle Snow, who stood beside their guild leader, in envy. She had thought of the 2 women as rivals, but now, they were utterly out of her reach. Now that Zero Wing had the support of 2 superpowers, it could definitely ascend to the upper levels of God's domain in the future. While everyone talked about Zero Wing, a commotion erupted outside of the arena. Shortly after, a group of 400-plus players entered. Even the lowest-leveled player among this group was level 64, with their weakest piece of equipment being level 60 Fine Gold rank. They all wore Starlink's guild emblem, and the dozen or so players in the lead possessed several epic weapons and equipment, wearing no less than level 60 Dark Gold items. A faint glow enveloped these dozen or so players as if they were the incarnations of gods. Mu Lingshaw was stunned. Not even Unyielding Soul's main force was likely a match for these players. Sure enough, they've come. Mu Cheng's expression gradually became serious as he watched the leaders of Starlink's force. Chapter 2085, Glory? Chapter 2085, Glory? There were many experts in the magnificent auction arena. Some among them even served as pillars in their large guilds, and there were quite a few peak experts from the various superpowers. However, when Starlink's members entered the arena, everyone gasped as they felt the intense pressure emitting from these players. Starlink's members didn't feel like players, but great lords. The crowd subconsciously submitted as those players' aura washed over them. Even peak experts felt the threat of death from the dozen or so Starlink members in the lead. Why are they here? Deep Thunder's expression similarly changed when he saw Starlink's members, surprise and fear flashing in his eyes. Grandpa, who are those people? Why do even superpowers peak experts seem afraid of them? Mu Lingshaw could not help but ask as she watched the various spectating superpowers peak experts in confusion. While it was true that Starlink's members were strong, the watching peak experts were as well. Even if there were a difference between superpowers' strength, there should be no reason for the spectating peak experts to fear Starlink's experts, but every one of their faces twisted with anxiety. Her grandfather, Mu Cheng, was a true domain realm expert, and his nickname of Thousand Hands was no trivial matter. Although he had grown weaker with age, he could still easily handle peak experts. However, when her grandfather saw the dozen or so players leading Starlink's team, he seemed to share the spectating expert's trepidation. She found this situation truly baffling. Zero Wing really has no chance in the struggle for White River City now. Mu Cheng could not help his bitter smile as he watched Starlink's leading members. He had thought that they could help Zero Wing hold White River City with the combination of Nature Hall's assistance and his fame. After all, the various participating superpowers had their own NPC cities to prioritize. They would only be able to dispatch a limited portion of their strength to secure White River City's auction house. However, it seemed he had underestimated Starlink's feelings toward Zero Wing. Are they really that strong? Mu Lingshaw was even more surprised by her grandfather's comment. They're not just strong. Against these people, even veteran super guilds like the Battle Wolves and Sacred Temple would have to take their opponents seriously. Otherwise, their defeat would be almost guaranteed. Mu Cheng explained as he watched the 4 white-haired men among Starlink's team. To think that Starlink would recruit the 4 shadow demons. I've known that Starlink has been gathering an extraordinary amount of strength in secret, but I hadn't thought that it was so capable. Even unyielding soul is likely in danger. The 4 shadow demons. After giving the name some thought, Mu Lingshaw asked in surprise, are they the 4 lunatics that shook up the various superpowers years ago? The 4 shadow demons had been very well known more than a decade ago, but unlike the name suggested, these 4 didn't operate as a group. They hadn't even known each other, acting independently. These 4 people had earned the nickname 4 shadow demons because of how much trouble they had caused the various superpowers, killing countless experts and peak experts. Not even unyielding soul had been spared from the 4 shadow demons' mischief. All 4 of these players were madmen. Moreover, they were independent players, and as a result, the various superpowers had a very difficult time tracking them down and dealing with them. During the height of their troublemaking, these 4 had been a hot topic among the general populace, so the secret pavilion had named them the 4 shadow demons, a nickname that had spread across the virtual gaming world. The various superpowers had the greatest headache trying to deal with players like the 4 shadow demons. Not only were they extremely powerful, but they were also insufferable lunatics. With all 4 of these madmen here, it was easy to imagine how frightening this competition would be. Meanwhile, hundreds of players wearing Blackwater's guild emblem sat quietly in one of the top-floor VIP rooms. The inflexible, middle-aged man who led the group looked down at Shifeng, watching the swordsman with a smug grin. If Shifeng were there, he would have recognized the middle-aged man as Jing Yang, the Blackwater representative that had visited Zero Wing's main headquarters not long ago. Sure enough, Vice Guild leader was right. Starlink has secretly recruited those 4 old ghosts, Jing Yang said, smiling. I doubt even Zero Wing would have thought this could happen. Then, should we take action now? Snowscar asked as he glanced at Shifeng. No. It is too soon. Let's wait until the competition officially begins before we teach Zero Wing the meaning of despair. Even if we say nothing, Zero Wing will beg us to take their combat puppets, Jing Yang said, laughing. The arena's atmosphere had drastically changed when the 4 shadow demons had appeared. Everyone had been optimistic about Zero Wing's success in the competition. The guild had support from 2 superpowers, potential was limitless. However, such thoughts had been abandoned. It seems Zero Wing has reached the end of the line. Melody, you better give up now. Zero Wing can no longer back Ninth Heaven. Only setting sun can ensure Ninth Heaven's glory in Forest City. Now, a young, handsome male half-elf said. Zero Wing might have been able to deal with the Death God workshop, but now that it's on the brink of destruction, how could it possibly afford to help your guild? Don't think that Starlink only has the 4 shadow demons. The dozen or so experts around them aren't ordinary, either. Take that blue-armored swordsman, for example. He has earned the nickname Illusion Swordsman, and his combat standards are on par with Miracle Dragons. There's also that tall shield warrior. He's called Mountain Horn and can rival Cuttlefish, the Iron Wall from Crimson Emperor. Every one of those people is an absolute peak expert. Moreover, Starlink has given all of them epic weapons and equipment. Just these people's strength is more than enough to make a super first-rate guild like Unyielding Soul suffer in a bitter battle, not to mention a guild like Zero Wing. Could Zero Wing really be doomed? Melody wondered as she looked at Shifeng. She had no rebuttal for the half-elf man. He had only spoken the truth. Even with 2 supporting superpowers, Zero Wing wasn't a match for the full force of another superpower. Unlike Melody's despair, Skyview was overjoyed. So what if you have 2 superpowers to support you, Black Flame? It can't change the fact that you will watch as someone takes White River City from you. Skyview threw his head back and laughed. When he had watched one big shot after another stand up for Zero Wing, he had sighed at his own weakness. But who would have thought that the situation would change so drastically in the blink of an eye? Zero Wing had enjoyed endless glory in the auction arena since it arrived, but in the end, it was still an ant on the chessboard of God's domain. The guild was still easy prey for superpowers. As everyone chatted amongst themselves, a bell abruptly rang, echoing throughout White River City as it signaled the start of the auction arena's competition. Chapter 2086 Expert Foundations. Chapter 2086 Expert Foundations. White River City fell silent as the sound of the starting bell echoed throughout its streets. Almost everyone's breathing quickened in anticipation as they stared intently at the magic mirrors lining the business district, afraid to miss a single moment of the upcoming struggle. Many players outside of White River City had pulled up Starmoon Kingdom's official forums to watch the live streams. For a moment, this competition had rendered the entire kingdom silent. The spectators in the auction arena itself tensed as they quietly watched the massive globe of water that had appeared above the arena. The gigantic globe displayed the qualifying round's rules, which were unlike those of any competition previously held in the auction arena. The previous competitions had been fighting tournaments or betting matches between players. The rewards had been subpar, and very few players had been interested in taking part, although any player could join these competitions. However, since this competition involved the management rights to White River City's auction house, the system had set up a qualifying round before the official matches. Only those who passed the qualifiers could join the official struggle. If one failed to meet the requirements, all of the resources in the world couldn't help them. It's just a qualifying round, yet the participation fee is so high? The spectating players gasped when they saw the participation cost of one epic material. Epic materials were still incredibly rare among the various large guilds. An ordinary large guild would be fortunate to accumulate around 30 epic materials. Such items even had an extremely low drop rate in 100-man, hard mode team dungeons. Moreover, the main god system had reduced the drop rate to 0 for players that exceeded the dungeon's level limit to prevent players from abusing low-level team dungeons. Sending low-level members to grind these team dungeons was also useless for a guild. These players wouldn't be able to raid the dungeons even if their guilds gave them top-tier equipment. Team dungeons tested players' combat standards as well as their equipment standards, and it would be extremely foolish for a guild to have its members with high combat standards maintain low levels. As players reached higher levels in God's domain, they'd encounter more fortuitous opportunities. Instructing experts to remain at a lower level would ruin the guild and the player's development. Because of this, the various major powers had stockpiled very few epic materials. Yet, the auction arena charged 1 epic material per participant, and every participating power had brought at least several dozen members. However, despite the crowd's sentiments, more than 100 powers paid the participation fee. Starlink, in particular, paid for more than 400 participants. When they saw this, the spectators couldn't help but shudder. Even the independent players watching from outside of the auction house couldn't help but gape in shock. Everyone had known before this that the various superpowers shouldn't be provoked and possessed wealth that far surpassed first-rate guilds, but they were still blown away when they saw how many members the various superpowers had dispatched for this competition. Moreover, this was only for one city. Many of these superpowers were contesting for multiple cities. Superpowers could truly kill people with wealth alone, so, this is a superpower. Melody was even more distraught when she saw how many Starlink members would take part in this struggle. Setting aside its members' combat standards, the fact that Starlink had the financial strength to dispatch more than 400 players was enough to devastate second-rate guilds like Ninth Heaven. The competition for the auction house didn't operate like a fighting tournament. In the official competition, players would be evenly distributed onto 5 separate, spacious battlefields. Players would then have to slaughter each other and claim the energy crystals that would randomly fall from above. Whichever power had the most energy crystals at the end of the competition would secure the auction house's management rights. However, not only were players prohibited from using tools on the battlefield, but they were also banned from using large-scale spells. The main god system truly was intent on testing the participating powers' comprehensive strength. It didn't allow any trickery whatsoever. Although Zero Wing had dispatched 112 players to this competition, even more than top-ranked first-rate guilds like the Bloodbath family and Holy Reincarnation, it paled in comparison to Starlink's 400-plus members. Moreover, King's Return had sent 300-plus members, Blackwater had dispatched 200-plus, and Pantheon had arrived with 200-plus members. None of these superpowers should be underestimated. The other superpowers were mostly here to watch, not planning to compete for White River City. So, they had only paid for a few members to participate for the experience. Although the various superpowers foundations had shocked the crowd, What happened next utterly stupefied everyone watching. Each of the qualifying round's participating players was teleported to an independent room, all of which had over a dozen trolls. The weakest of these trolls was a lord, while the strongest was a great lord, and each room had a total of 3 great lords. All of the trolls were level 65, slightly higher than the participating players' average level. Players had to defeat 3 level 65 great lords and more than 10 level 65 lords in the qualifying round. Even ordinary experts would flee from such a monster group, yet the system wanted them to survive against these monsters for 1 minute. To make matters worse, players couldn't use tools. Many of the expert players in the arena despaired when they saw how difficult this qualifying round would be. Is the system joking? The system must be crazy. I can't even last 30 seconds against 1 level 65 Great Lord, much less against 3 of them. At first, many of the watching experts had hated themselves for not having any epic materials and losing out on the perfect opportunity to make a name for themselves, but after seeing the qualifying round's challenge, they were relieved. If they had paid to participate, they would have wasted an epic material for nothing. As expected of the auction house's struggle, this is amazing. The qualifying round already has such high standard. This trip here was definitely worth it. The standards are indeed quite high. I'm afraid that most of the participants will be disqualified during this round. Only those superpowers will have a significant number of experts make it to the true competition. The small guilds that are trying to make a name for themselves will likely be disappointed. Although, aside from those superpowers, I'm fairly certain that the Dark Knight Empire's Bloodbath family, the Glory Empire's Holy Reincarnation, and the Purple Thorns Kingdom's Sin Realm will have quite a few members pass the qualifying round. That's probably true. Not only are those guilds supported by powerful corporations, but they also have plenty of expert members. Zero Wing really is unlucky. It should have had a fighting chance since it dispatched 40 or so more players than the participating first-rate guilds, but after this round, Zero Wing will likely have far fewer members in the official competition than the first-rate guilds. That's right. Although Zero Wing has been developing wonderfully recently, it hasn't had enough time to develop to a sufficient level. Its foundations simply cannot compare to veteran first-rate guilds. If Zero Wing had accepted some major company or corporation's investments, it would have likely been a match for guilds like the Bloodbath family and Sin Realm. Everyone talked about the competition's qualifying round. They all had guesses about how many players from the participating guilds would make it to the competition after this round. However, nobody questioned the various superpowers performances, comparing the first-rate guilds' abilities instead. 1 minute passed quickly, and excited, everyone shifted their attention to the massive water globe hovering over the auction arena. They couldn't wait to see how the participating powers would perform. Thousand Light Family, 9 people passed. Blast Adventurer Team, 5 people passed. Bloodbath Family, 32 people passed. Star Alliance, 17 people passed. Sin Realm, 26 people passed. Holy Reincarnation, 35 people passed. King's Return, 237 people passed. Pantheon, 175 people passed. Blackwater, 204 people passed. Starlink, 339 people passed. Zero Wing, 107 people passed. Chapter 2087, Passing Rate? Chapter 2087, Passing Rate? What's going on? I thought Zero Wing only sent 112 members. How did so many of them pass? The players in the auction arena stared with wide eyes when they saw how many Zero Wing members had made it through the qualifiers, unable to believe their eyes. The various major powers waiting for the official competition's start were just as baffled. Impossible. The system must have made a mistake. Skyview practically shouted when he saw the numbers on the water globe. Zero Wing had only paid for 112 participating members in the qualifying round, yet 107 of them had made it through. This passing rate was absolutely horrifying. Only about 55% of the teams from top-ranked first-rate guilds like Bloodbath Family, Sin Realm, and Holy Reincarnation had passed the trial. Even then, it was impressive. Ordinary first-rate guilds like the Star Alliance only had a 40% passing rate. As for the various participating superpowers, even the best-performing guild, Blackwater, had only managed 88% of its team, yet 95.5% of Zero Wing's members had cleared the qualifying round, surpassing Blackwater. No matter how Skyview thought about the situation, he couldn't believe it. Superpowers had plenty of experts and detailed training programs that were particularly efficient when nurturing players. Ordinary powers simply couldn't compare. Moreover, the players that were powerful enough to be considered for this competition were the various powers experts among experts. Yet, Zero Wing had surpassed all of them. Skyview wasn't the only confused player. Not even the various major powers members could fathom how Zero Wing had built such a powerful foundation. Zero Wing is amazing. Its passing rate is even higher than those superpowers. Didn't they say that Zero Wing hasn't had enough time to develop, and its foundation regarding expert players is weak? Why do I feel like Zero Wing's expert foundation is even stronger than those top-ranked first-rate guilds? When the independent players watching from outside of the auction house saw Zero Wing's passing rate, they re-evaluated their opinions of the guild, especially the expert players from other kingdoms and empires. Based on the passing rates, it was, more or less, clear that Zero Wing's expert foundation was no weaker than top-ranked first-rate guilds. In fact, it might even be slightly stronger than its competition. The difference is actually so great. Galaxy Past was at a loss for words as he stared at the magic water globe. He had thought that the Star Alliance had a chance against Zero Wing's expert foundation. After developing for so long, the Star Alliance had grown considerably. Nowadays, God's Domain's popularity continued to increase, and more people joined the game every day. As a result, more experts continued to rise. Not only had the Star Alliance successfully nurtured a lot of experts, but it had also recruited experts from elsewhere. The guild was many times stronger than when it had joined God's Domain. However, only 40% of the Star Alliance's players had made it through the qualifying round, while 95.5% of Zero Wing's players had succeeded. No matter how Galaxy Past looked at it, the Star Alliance wasn't on the same playing field as Zero Wing. Meanwhile, when Melody, who watched from a private spectator room, saw the passing rates, the darkness in her eyes vanished. She couldn't help her growing excitement as if she had just seen a ray of hope illuminate a dark sky. However, despite Melody's elation, the half-elf man beside her remained unperturbed. "I'm assuming that you think Zero Wing now has some hope of holding White River City, right?" the half-elf man said as he glanced at Shifeng, who stood in the auction arena. "Unfortunately, that is still impossible. Zero Wing's passing rate is amazing, but no matter how many players made it through the last round, Zero Wing still only has 107 members participating in the official competition. Compared to the 4 participating superpowers, that is nothing. Even Pantheon, the superpower with the fewest members in the competition, has 68 more players than Zero Wing. At the end of the day, this competition is a test of a guild's comprehensive strength. Zero Wing might be able to deal with top-ranking first-rate guilds like the Bloodbath family and Holy Reincarnation, but it doesn't have the power to contend with superpowers. But, although Melody wanted to argue, she knew his words were true when she saw how calmly the various superpowers members had reacted to Zero Wing's results. Even the various top-ranked first-rate guilds, whose members had been surprised to see Zero Wing's success a moment ago, regained their composure as they realized that the strength Zero Wing had displayed did nothing to change its circumstances. Meanwhile, an old man in black armor with a slightly hunched back stood at the lead of King's Return's team in the auction arena. After taking a look at the water globe, this old man smiled and turned to Mu Cheng, who stood a short distance away. "Brother Mu, long time no see. I hadn't expected to see you in action again." "I certainly didn't expect to find you here," the hunchbacked man said, smiling. "You're here as well, so what's so strange about my presence?" Mu Cheng asked the old man. Although his tone was disdainful, vigilance filled his gaze as he addressed the hunchbacked, old man. He was vigilant because this man was one of King's Return's old monsters. He had risen to fame more than 3 decades ago, earning the nickname Blind Man. While his nickname sounded demeaning, The older generation's expert players knew it was by no means an insult. In fact, it was the highest form of praise. This old man was truly blind in the real world, but since virtual reality games connected to the brain directly, they allowed people with disabilities to function as if they had none in the game world. Naturally, those with sight disabilities could see normally in the game world. However, not only did Blind Man recover his sight in virtual reality games, but his sight was also far sharper than the ordinary person's. By relying on his superior sight, he had carved a place for himself in the virtual gaming world. The secret pavilion had even called him the all-seeing sword saint. Even when Mu Cheng had been at his peak, he had only been able to win 4 out of 10 fights with Blind Man. I've heard that you have a close relationship with Zero Wing. Is that true? Unfortunately, our king's return has a little enmity with one of that guild's little fellows. How about this? If you don't help Zero Wing, we won't target the guild, Blind Man asked, chuckling. Blind Man's suggestion rendered Mu Cheng speechless. It seemed that Zero Wing wasn't satisfied with provoking superpowers like Starlink and Blackwater, but it had provoked King's return as well. However, when Mu Cheng saw that more than 200 people standing behind Blind Man and compared them to the dozen or so subordinates behind himself, he could not help but nod helplessly, replying, "Fine, it's a deal." Mu Cheng then turned to look at the distant Shifeng and muttered to himself, "This is the most I can do to help you." When the various major powers members overheard the old men's conversation, they couldn't help but send Zero Wing sneers and looks of pity. Zero Wing is always so arrogant, provoking so many superpowers. Now, these superpowers want retribution. Ha ha ha. So what if more than 100 players from Zero Wing made it through the qualifiers? In the end, its efforts mean nothing. Now that Zero Wing had lost one of its capable supporters, its chances of holding White River City had fallen even further. Time passed quickly. After another 2 minutes, the qualifying players were distributed across 5 different battlefields. Each battlefield was the size of a small leveling map, easily accommodating tens of thousands of players. The rules for this competition were quite simple. The competition had a 3-hour time limit, and throughout its duration, energy crystals would randomly fall into the battlefield. The power that secured the most energy crystals after 3 hours would be crowned as the victor. When the bell rang throughout the 5 battlefields, the official competition began as every player in Star Moon Kingdom watched. Everyone, listen up. Prioritize Zero Wing's members above all others. When the competition began, the various major powers issued commands to target Zero Wing to curry favor with the various superpowers. I found some of Zero Wing's members here. Good. Get rid of them first. We'll fight for the energy crystals later. As soon as the major powers members discovered Zero Wings, they charged toward them. Zero Wing? Die. Skyview sneered when he saw the beauty observing her surroundings. He immediately charged at the woman from Zero Wing alongside a dozen or so of his subordinates. Chapter 2088, Suppressing Enemies with One Move. Chapter 2088, Suppressing Enemies with One Move. As the official competition began, Zero Wing's spectating members paled. The auction arena's competition should have been a free-for-all between the various participating superpowers, but now, almost every player targeted Zero Wing. These superpowers moved as if they had already made an agreement. How can this be? Melody, who watched the competition through a magic mirror, was utterly devastated as she watched the various powers experts work together against Zero Wing's members. Dealing with several superpowers in this competition was one thing. After all, the auction arena had 5 independent battlefields, and players would be randomly distributed across them. Combined, these hostile superpowers only had around 1,000 members in total, and after being split between 5 battlefields, their numbers thinned. Locating Zero Wing's members across such a large map wouldn't be easy with so few players. Moreover, victory in the auction arena didn't depend on the number of kills one had. Players simply needed to contest for the energy crystals that would appear. As long as Zero Wing avoided confrontation with these several superpowers and focused on securing energy crystals, it definitely had hope of securing White River City's auction house. However, That hope was dashed if those superpowers worked together. While the various powers might not have as many participating members as the various superpowers, when combined, they easily outnumbered the more powerful guilds by 3 or 4 times. Even if the battlefields were quite large, locating Zero Wing's members wouldn't be a challenge if all of these powers cooperated. I told you long ago that the various superpowers in God's domain are not as simple as you. Zero Wing has severely underestimated its enemies since the very beginning, as well. Zero Wing doesn't have the slightest chance of winning this competition, the half-elf man said calmly. This competition is simply Zero Wing's execution. Rather than military strength, the various superpowers' influence over lesser guilds was truly frightening. The various participating powers understood that they would reach greater heights instantly if they could curry favor with a superpower. This was also why the various powers had become jealous when they had learned that 2 superpowers backed Zero Wing. Normally, trying to gain a superpower's support wasn't easy, but Zero Wing had presented the perfect opportunity to do just that. While the half-elf man expressed his opinion, Skyview and the dozen or so experts from other powers on battlefield number 4 closed in on the beautiful woman wearing a 6-winged emblem. The magic mirrors along the city's business district displayed the scene clearly. Isn't that beauty Graceful Moon, the former Firecloud Fox Adventurer Team's vice commander, an expert from the Black Dragon Empire asked, recognizing the woman on the magic mirror immediately. She's Graceful Moon. I had heard that she used to be quite strong, only slightly off from becoming one of the top 100 summoners in the Black Dragon Empire. Many first-rate guilds had tried to recruit her. I had never thought that she would join Zero Wing. But she's not very lucky. A group of enemies spotted her right off the bat. She'll likely be the first person to disqualify from the competition, a level 63 male ranger said, sighing as he gazed at Graceful Moon's beauty. She's not just unlucky, she's extremely unlucky. Setting aside Skyview, one of Sin Realm's newly minted 10 great experts, the man and woman beside him are exceptional experts, a level 64 Guardian Knight commented. That glamorous woman is elegant insanity, one of Holy Reincarnation's rising geniuses. I've heard that she's the second-ranked assassin in her guild. If not for her lack of achievements, she would have ranked on the God's Domain experts list long ago. As for that stalwart, silver-armored man, his Howling Earth, one of the Bloodbath family's top 4 berserkers. He also has the hidden class, Blood Rage Warrior. The lower his HP gets, the greater his combat power becomes. He previously defeated 2 experts from the God's Domain experts list. Those 2 working together would be enough to trouble a peak expert. Include the other powers experts, even a peak expert would have to flee. Everyone around the level 64 Guardian Knight gasped in shock. Even a superpower's peak experts would have to flee if they encountered such a force without support, not to mention Graceful Moon, who hadn't even ranked among the top 100 of her class in the Black Dragon Empire. When the spectating crowd discussed Graceful Moon's opponents, Skyview and his companions surrounded her. Die! Skyview shouted as the surrounding mana surged to him, increasing the intensity of his aura. He felt like a humanoid great lord. He then launched the Tier 2 curse, violent flame spears at Graceful Moon, sending 28 fiery spears toward the woman from multiple directions. Howling Earth also shouted, and his muscles bulged as he leaped up with his giant war hammer raised. He swung his weapon down toward Graceful Moon like a mountain descending on the female summoner. In contrast, Elegant Insanity vanished, waiting patiently for an opportunity to land a fatal blow. The 3 experts cooperated as if they had fought together for many years. Their attack's timing was perfect, leaving Graceful Moon no room to dodge. As the war hammer and flame spears flew toward the level 65 summoner, Graceful Moon, who had stood motionless, finally made her move. She raised Fallen Language, her epic staff, and summoned a level 70, Great Lord-ranked steel-armed ape. At the same time, 3 level 70 Lord-ranked Rock Guardians appeared around her. The Rock Guardians were elemental creatures, so their innate magic resistance was quite high. The 3 Rock Guardians served as an impenetrable wall, stopping every incoming flame spear. The stead-armed ape stood 3 meters tall and was covered in golden magic circuits, which had been tattooed across its body. With arms thicker than its legs, The steel-armed ape swung at the descending warhammer. Boom! With the sound of an explosion, Howling Earth was thrown back. When he landed, he discovered that both of his arms had numbed. The steel-armed ape's strength definitely surpassed that of ordinary great lords. However, while Howling Earth had flown through the air, a black figure had appeared beside Graceful Moon. This figure was none other than Elegant Insanity. The snow-white dagger in her right hand silently slid toward Graceful Moon's throat like a cunning snake. Since Graceful Moon had just finished casting a spell and her physique as a summoner wasn't formidable, she had no defensive options to protect herself from Elegant Insanity's swift, silent attack. Just as everyone expected to see the assassin's attack land, a gigantic, stone palm appeared above Elegant Insanity's head, descending on the female assassin like a falling mountain. She had no choice but to abandon her attack and evade. However, as Elegant Insanity tried to dodge the Rock Guardian's attack, the remaining 2 Rock Guardians attacked the assassin's blind spots as if they had prepared for this moment. Caught off guard, Elegant Insanity couldn't dodge or block any of the incoming attacks. Damn it! Elegant Insanity frowned. She immediately activated Wind Steps, using the brief moment of invulnerability to survive the attacks. Peng! Peng! With 2 muffled sounds, Elegant Insanity was thrown like a cannonball, only stopping after she crashed into a large tree. Although she didn't take any damage, a trace of fear flashed in her eyes when she looked at Graceful Moon. Against a coordinated attack from 3 powerful experts like herself, Sky View, and Howling Earth, even a peak expert would have to use a life-saving skill or face impending death. However, these 3 were actually at a disadvantage against Graceful Moon. The spectating players outside of the arena gaped in shock as they watched the events unfold. The Black Dragon Empire's experts, who were familiar with the female summoner, were particularly stunned. Was this female summoner the same Graceful Moon they knew? Chapter 2089, Shocking the Whole Arena So Strong. Chapter 2089, Shocking the Whole Arena So Strong. Zero Wing has hidden such a powerful expert. The first fight in Battlefield Number 4 astonished the crowd outside of the auction house. Seeing as how Graceful Moon smoothly stopped the incoming attacks from 3 experts, all of which ranked among the top in their top-ranked, first-rate guilds, it was clear that her combat standards could definitely rival those of Superpower's peak experts. Within a superpower, every peak expert served as a vital support pillar, and the various first-rate guilds feared them all. A peak expert could single-handedly wipe out a 100-man team of ordinary experts. Smaller guilds had no hope of suppressing a peak expert without constricting their players to operate in teams of several hundred. At the very least, some peak experts who had chosen classes with high survivability could come and go as they pleased. She only recently joined Zero Wing, yet she's already grown so strong. Yi Luorfei, who watched from a second-floor spectator room, blinked in surprise as she stared at Graceful Moon incredulously. As the vice commander of FFF, a top adventurer team in the Black Dragon Empire, Yi Luorfei had a certain familiarity with the Empire's well-known adventurer teams. Due to Graceful Moon's performance in the last ranking battle in the Empire, Yi Luorfei had made sure to pay extra close attention to her. However, Yi Luorfei remembered Graceful Moon displaying combat standards that hadn't even rivaled those of first-rate guilds' peak experts, much less refinement realm experts like Sky View, Elegant Insanity, and Howling Earth. Yet, this female summoner suppressed all 3 refinement realm experts by herself. Graceful Moon's newfound strength shocked Yi Luorfei. Moreover, this situation wasn't like Yi Luorfei's defeat against Zhao Yueru during the ranking battles. Zhao Yueru had relied on superior basic attributes and spells to win, but as a true Void Realm expert, Yi Luorfei recognized that the same couldn't be said for Graceful Moon. Graceful Moon's success was simply a result of her impeccable ability to control her summoned creatures. Not only have her basic attributes risen, but her combat standards have skyrocketed as well. It seems Zero Wing still has some secrets, Yang Tianxing, FFF's commander, commented as he watched Graceful Moon with squinted eyes, a hit of surprise flashing in his gaze. After the FFF adventurer team had secretly joined the Flower of Seven Sins, the adventurer team's upper echelons had gained a lot of detailed information on the various superpowers. Hence, Yang Tianxing understood how frightening they truly were. Their ability to nurture experts, in particular, was truly amazing. Other powers simply couldn't compete. As a peak expert that had risen to fame in the virtual gaming world many years ago and was only a short distance away from reaching the domain realm, Yang Tianxing recognized that Graceful Moon's current combat standards were quite powerful. Only, her strength was atypical. Normally, players tried to gain more control of their own bodies and their familiarity with the world around them to increase their combat standards, but Graceful Moon felt as if she were actively using the world itself to her benefit. While everyone was shocked over her performance, the female summoner in question began to chant another spell. As she did, her staff started to glow with a dazzling, purple light. Tier 2 Curse, Life Link. This curse linked the player with their summoned creatures, sharing their senses. Although the curse lowered the player's basic attributes by 50%, it increased the linked summoned creature's basic attributes by 20% of the player's normal attributes. Suddenly, golden magic circuits flashed on the steel-armed ape and rock guardians as their auras became even more intense. Before anyone could react, the 4 summoned creatures exploded into action and charged at Graceful Moon's enemies. 2 of the Lord-ranked rock guardians effortlessly dispersed the dozen or so attacking experts. The 3rd rock guardian remained by its summoner's side, repelling all incoming attacks. Meanwhile, the steel-armed ape charged toward Howling Earth, pummeling the hammer-wielding Bloodrage warrior. After the steel-armed ape's first hit landed, Howling Earth's arms were numb, and the ground beneath him had cracked. The second hit numbed the Bloodrage warrior's entire body, substantially decreasing his reaction speed. Howling Earth had no power to respond to the steel-armed ape's third attack, taking the strike with his shoulders and sinking into the ground past his knees. With the 4th hit, the summoned creature hammered Howling Earth completely into the ground. On the 5th hit, Howling Earth died, becoming the first disqualified player from Battlefield Number 4. Skyview and his comrades were dumbfounded. Their group's healers didn't even have time to finish casting their spells before the steel-armed ape killed Howling Earth. The summoned creature's strength was simply horrific. As one of Bloodbath family's top-ranked berserkers, Howling Earth had unbound his weapons and equipment to level 60 Dark Gold rank before entering the battlefield. Only, he hadn't unbound his epic weapon completely. To unbind an epic item to its normal rank on the battlefield, one had to pay 3 epic materials. On the other hand, restoring all of one's weapons and equipment to Dark Gold rank only cost 5 epic materials. Meanwhile, a full set of level 60 Dark Gold equipment was more than enough to grant Howling Earth the strength of a High Lord of the same level. Even without a healer, he should be able to contend with a Great Lord of the same level for quite some time. Yet, a level 70, Great Lord-ranked steel-armed ape had killed Howling Earth in just 5 moves. Moreover, the steel-armed ape hadn't used any techniques or skills. It had relied on brute force to kill its enemy. Damn it! How many epic items does she have on her? Elegant Insanity stared at the female summoner in astonishment. At first, the steel-armed ape had only displayed enough strength to make Howling Earth stumble, but after receiving 20% of Graceful Moon's basic attributes, its strength had increased so drastically. Since the steel-armed ape hadn't used any skills thus far, Graceful Moon's basic attributes must be so incredibly high that a mere 20% was enough to give a level 70 steel-armed ape the strength of a level 65 Grand Lord. Before its enemies recovered from their shock, the steel-armed ape charged toward the nearby group. With the exception of Skyview and Elegant Insanity, the summoned creature killed every expert with 2 hits. However, the 2 peak experts didn't fare much better. Skyview died after 4 punches, and Elegant Insanity only survived until the 7th. In less than 30 seconds, the various major powers experts, who had tried to gang up on Graceful Moon, fell under the female summoner's retaliation. None of them had been able to fight back. This outcome stunned the watching crowd, but they also considered it reasonable. Players weren't allowed to use berserk skills in the arena, and without those skills, how were they supposed to fight a Grand Lord under another player's control? Zero Wing is insane. It dumped so many resources onto Graceful Moon. In my opinion, I think Zero Wing's decision was a wise one. At the very least, with a Grand Lord on its side, no ordinary power can eliminate Zero Wing. The crowd fell into a heated debate over Graceful Moon's strength. They had never expected Zero Wing to pull such a move. With this, Zero Wing should acquire plenty of energy crystals in battlefield number 4. Zero Wing certainly has a lot of clever tricks, the half-elf man beside Melody said, sneering at Graceful Moon through a magic mirror. However, while pouring its resources into a few select experts will allow them to perform well, what could a small number of players hope to accomplish on such large battlefields? Each battlefield would spawn 3 to 6 energy crystals at set intervals. As long as players held the crystals for 10 minutes, their ownership would become permanent, not even dropping if the player died. As the half-elf man finished speaking, easily more than 300 players were teleported back to the auction arena, in one group after another. An uproar tore through the auction arena's crowd. What's wrong with those people? The half-elf man turned to the ruckus in the stands in confusion. While most of the participating powers worked together against Zero Wing's members, there were bound to be exceptions. Seeing a large number of players return at the same time shouldn't be surprising. But when the half-elf man raised his eyes to the magic mirrors displaying the fights in other battlefields, his expression froze. Impossible. The several dozen magic mirrors in the center of the auction arena all displayed battles involving Zero Wing's members. Some of these Zero Wing players fought 2 or 3 opponents at the same time, while others faced more than 10. Every one of Zero Wing's members displayed combat standards that could rival Refinement Realm experts. Moreover, they all showed off their extraordinarily high basic attributes. The expert players that had returned from the battlefields were Zero Wing's victims. Chapter 2090 Ant. Chapter 2090 Ant. Blood, dust, and smoke filled the gigantic magic mirror's screens as they hovered above the arena. Corpses, what remained of the various major powers experts, littered the battlefield, while Zero Wing's members remained standing. However, despite their success, Zero Wing's members seemed incredibly calm, as if they had only slain mobs along the roadside. This scene shocked the upper echelons and expert players from the several hundred spectating major powers. Zero Wing's members had killed over 300 of the various major powers' top experts without breaking a sweat, and contrary to expectations, the responsible party didn't just include a dozen or so players. Rather, several dozen players were responsible for this slaughter. This is interesting. Mu Cheng, who was assigned to Battlefield Noel, could not help but smile at the magic mirror above the battlefield. Even he had assumed that Zero Wing was doomed to part with White River City's auction house. He had never imagined that Zero Wing had such a sturdy foundation. On an ordinary battlefield, having a small number of powerful players that could defeat multiple players at once would be wonderful, but this was the auction arena. Players' goal here was to obtain energy crystals, so it was best to have as many capable experts as possible. At most, the various major powers would admire Zero Wing's battle strategy after watching Graceful Moon kill over a dozen experts by herself. It had merely been a clever trick to these guilds, proving nothing. However, now that several dozen Zero Wing members had performed similarly, the various major powers were beginning to feel afraid. The fact that Zero Wing could dispatch several dozen extremely powerful experts was proof of the guild's solid foundations. If Zero Wing had so many powerful experts, annihilating any of their guilds would likely be a piece of cake. Furthermore, so many experts meant that Zero Wing had the strength to fight the various superpowers for White River City's auction house. If Zero Wing held this auction house and eventually grew into a superpower, the powers that had opposed the guild today would suffer. How can a guild that only established after God's Domain's launch have so many powerful experts and epic resources? Dust Blood, who had been assigned to Battlefield Number 3, glowered as he watched 8 of his guildmates return to the auction arena. Outsiders might not know these 8 players, but he, as the leader of Bloodbath family's team for this competition, did. To prepare for this auction house competition, the guild had invested over half of its epic material stock to allow 32 participants to restore their weapons and equipment to Dark Gold rank. However, not only had Zero Wing dispatched more than twice as many players to the official competition, but every participant had unbound their weapons and equipment to Dark Gold rank at the very least. Based on what Dustblood could see, quite a few Zero Wing members had even restored their equipment to epic rank. Not even the Bloodbath family and Holy Reincarnation could afford such an expenditure. Among the 8 slain Bloodbath family members, 2 were even bona fide refinement realm experts. Even in a superpower, these players would be treated as core members. But despite working with other powers in this competition, Zero Wing's players had defeated them. Moreover, the Zero Wing members responsible weren't even the guild's famous experts. Rather, they were just some of Zero Wing's main force members. Dust Blood couldn't believe it. Meanwhile, after watching more than 300 of their experts die, the various major powers dismissed the notion of targeting Zero Wing. They had only gone after the guild's members to curry favor with the various superpowers watching, but not only hadn't they defeated Zero Wing, but their actions might have also provoked a future superpower. Continuing to single out Zero Wing's members would be foolish. They had only spent so many resources to participate in the auction arena to prepare for the competitions in their own territories once their auction houses were promoted. Order quickly returned to the 5 battlefields as players began to clash with each other, competing for the descending energy crystals. Unless an energy crystal was at stake, the various major powers experts avoided Zero Wing's members as much as possible. For a time, Zero Wing's members moved across their battlefields with ease. The spectating crowd fell silent as they recognized this turn of events. Meanwhile, the Zero Wing members watching the competition grew excited. They all wished they were on those battlefields, as well. The various major powers that had visited Starmoon Kingdom had treated Zero Wing like dirt in the past. None of them had seen anything special about the kingdom's ruling guild. However, these foreign powers now bowed their heads, doing the best they could to avoid Zero Wing's attention. Wonderful! Without the other powers' interference, Zero Wing can safely compete for the energy crystals, Melody exclaimed as she watched Zero Wing's members traverse the 5 battlefields unhindered. Although Zero Wing didn't have as many members in the competition as the various superpowers, the energy crystals appeared randomly across all 5 battlefields. Without the various major powers' interference, Zero Wing would have an easier time fighting the participating superpowers for energy crystals. Compete for the energy crystals? Evil Judgment, the half-elf man beside Melody, laughed suddenly. What are you trying to say? Melody frowned as his reaction. She didn't think that Evil Judgment laughed at her out of envy, but due to her ignorance. With how important an auction house is to a guild, do you think the various superpowers will let anyone lesser compete? Evil Judgment asked as he gestured to the energy crystals falling into the 5 battlefields. The answer is a definite no. No tiger would allow an ant to contest for its territory. Naturally, the various superpowers won't allow insignificant players to take advantage of their fights between each other. Melody turned back to the magic mirrors displaying the battlefields, and what she saw darkened her expression. The 4 participating superpowers, which despised Zero Wing, had surrounded the first 5 energy crystals on each of the 5 battlefields. Each superpower had reserved 3 to 5 players to guard the energy crystals, working together to prevent other powers from approaching. How can this be? Melody was stunned. If only one superpower stood in their way, the various major powers wouldn't likely consider it much of a threat. When combined, they had an overwhelming numerical advantage. If they worked together, a lone superpower couldn't stop them. However, 4 superpowers were working together. Although each had only dispatched a small number of players to protect the energy crystals, these experts were extraordinarily powerful. Even working together, the various major powers had little hope of breaking past that blockade. The various major powers only outnumbered the 4 superpowers by 3 or 4 times. Such a small advantage wasn't enough to defeat the 4 cooperating superpowers. Moreover, if they annoyed these superpowers, they might set aside their competition and focus on the interfering players. If the 4 superpowers got serious, they could end these major powers. Knowing that such an outcome was possible, the various major powers wouldn't dare attack the superpowers. However, if the major powers did not act, Zero Wing wouldn't have any opportunities to take advantage of. I want to see just how you intend to hold White River City now, Zero Wing. Skyview roared with laughter when he saw the 4 superpowers cooperate. With them working together, one of these superpowers was guaranteed to win this auction arena competition. The other powers could only watch from the sidelines or declare themselves these superpowers' enemy. But who would dare attracted 4 superpowers' wrath? Yet, when everyone thought that no one would dare attack these 4 superpowers' blockade, several figures on battlefield number 1 dashed past the various major powers players and straight toward one of the energy crystals. So fast. Who are those people? Have they lost their minds? I thought I saw them wearing a 6-winged emblem. A 6-winged emblem? Isn't that 0 wings emblem? Chapter 2091, What if I refuse? Chapter 2091, What if I refuse? The crowd, the various major powers experts, had formed some distance away from the energy crystal shuddered when they realized that the 5 new arrivals were from 0 wing. The players watching from outside of the arena gaped in shock. Unlike the experts on the battlefield, they had a clear view of 0 wing's 5 members rapidly approaching the fallen energy crystal. Isn't that Black Flame? That can't be, can it? 4 superpowers are working together to guard that crystal. How could Black Flame dare to attack them? Has Black Flame lost his mind? He's charging in with only 4 companions. That's not enough to face a single superpower, much less 4. Does Black Flame really treat superpowers experts like ordinary experts from other guilds? Maybe this is his final stand. White River City is 0 Wing's main headquarters, and without it, at least half of 0 Wing's operations will be crippled. 0 Wing's behavior baffled everyone watching. No one had ever thought that 0 would make such a bold move. However, before Shifeng's group could get within 100 yards of the crystal, 17 figures appeared in their path. These 17 players gave off a soul-shuddering aura, and every one of them felt like a humanoid great lord. Even the major powers experts who stood some distance away felt stifled as these players' intense killing intent washed over them. These 17 players wore a mix of level 60 and level 65 dark gold equipment. Some among them even bore level 60 dark gold set equipment and weapons. Moreover, they had fully restored these items' ranks. Am I dreaming? Isn't that the level 60 Eternal Night set for assassins? Amazing. That Berserker is wearing the Passionate set. I've heard that even Holy Reincarnation has only collected 3 pieces of that set. So, this is a superpowers foundation? The watching independent and guild players watching gasped when they saw the 4 superpowers members that hadn't bothered to hide their weapons and equipment's glow effect. Most of the game's large guilds hadn't even collected a complete level 60 fine gold set equipment thus far. Only top-ranked first-rate guilds would have a few sets. As for a complete level 60 dark gold set equipment, that was utterly beyond the various large guilds' reach. Level 60 dark gold set equipment could only be obtained by raiding 100-man hell mode team dungeons or super large-scale hard mode team dungeons. Moreover, the drop rate in these dungeons was only around 3%. Super large-scale hell mode team dungeons had a slightly higher drop rate, but it still wasn't higher than 7%. Most first-rate guilds at this stage of their game hit their limit with level 60, 100-man hell mode team dungeons. They simply didn't have the power to raid super large-scale hell mode team dungeons. To the various large guilds, level 60 dark gold set equipment was godly right now. Yet, these 4 superpowers had more than one such set equipment. Why wouldn't this revelation be shocking? Anyone who takes another step forward dies, the level 65 male berserker in the Passionate set slowly stated, word by word, as he watched Shifeng's group without joy or despair. This berserker sounded like an emotionless robot. As soon this berserker spoke, the surrounding temperature dropped as an intense killing intent suppressed the space around him. It felt as if the gates to hell had just opened, and if any of these players took another step, they'd descend into hell itself. The distant experts shuddered as they felt the abrupt change. Is he really human? His killing intent is so powerful. Melody's expression darkened as she stared at the imposing berserker. Unlike the spectating players in the stands or outside of the auction house, those in spectator rooms could alter their room's environment to match that of the battlefields, allowing them to experience the battlefields to a certain extent. Melody had encountered plenty of experts in the fairy country, including quite a few that made her feel utterly powerless. However, None of these experts exuded as much killing intent as that berserker. Human. You can't consider him human anymore, Evil Judgment answered from beside Melody, shaking his head. Chuckling, he continued, I had never imagined that Starlink would successfully recruit that cold-blooded monster. With him, Zero Wing doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell of securing the energy crystal. Is he really that strong? Black Flame earned his title as the Sword King from the secret pavilion, Melody countered. Sword King? Evil Judgment laughed. Only first-rate and weaker guilds give that title any importance. The secret pavilion has recorded a lot of experts on the God's Domain experts list, but there are many more players that have slipped through the cracks. That cold-blooded monster is one of them. He's called Tengu, the Warring Ghost. Although Tengu hasn't reached the Domain realm yet, his brain doesn't work like everyone else's. You could say that his brain is particularly well developed, granting him a similar sixth sense to wild beasts. He can easily predict his opponent's movements. There's also his beast-like combat method to contend with. He is no weaker than Domain realm monsters. He's already killed more than 10,000 experts in God's Domain, including many peak experts from superpowers. However, due to his strange and violent nature, none of the superpowers have tried to recruit him. He's killed more than 10,000 experts. Melody was slightly stunned. She had only defeated several hundred experts since joining God's Domain. Even so, those fights had earned her plenty of combat experience, but the Warring Ghost had slain more than 10,000, and many of them had been superpowers peak experts. He was truly a monster. To make matters worse, this monster wore the Passionate set, one of the best sets available in the game right now. When the various superpowers members saw Warring Ghost intercept Shifeng's small group, they began to chat about the upcoming fight. Brother Mu, it seems Zero Wing has no hope of success in Battlefield number 1, Blind Man commented as he glanced at Mu Cheng, who stood a short distance away. He had heard much about the Warring Ghost, Tengu. If that man continued to grow stronger, he would undoubtedly reach the 4 Shadow Demons level. Although Black Flame was quite strong as well, the swordsman's strength should, at most, rival Tengu's. However, there were 4 other Zero Wing members present, while Tengu had a total of 17 allies. Zero Wing had no chance of reaching the energy crystal, much less claiming it. Starlink has truly invested a lot of its resources in this competition. Mu Cheng shook his head and sighed when he saw these players. Even Mu Cheng would struggle in a fight with Tengu. The weakest piece Tengu wore was level 65 Dark Gold rank, and he carried 2 pieces of epic equipment and an epic weapon. The Berserker's equipment was likely some of the very best God's Domain had to offer right now. Zero Wing's Black Flame, a beautiful woman in dark purple robes and wearing King's Returns guild emblem, muttered as she observed Shifeng. Smiling, she continued, although it is impressive that you've ranked so highly on the God's Domain experts list, this isn't a realm Zero Wing can reach. It'd be best if you left. Even if Nature Hall or Unyielding Soul step in to help you, Tengu will act without hesitation. The major powers experts watching from nearby nodded in agreement with this woman's warning. Although Zero Wing had surprised everyone with its strength, proving that it was even more powerful than a top-ranked first-rate guild, it couldn't compare to a superpower. If Zero Wing hadn't had Nature Hall and Unyielding Soul's support, the 4 allied superpowers would have likely attacked by now. You Zero Wing players should know what's good for you. Do you think you could have survived this long if we had moved against you early in this competition? A level 65 ranger from Starlink said, sneering at Shifeng. What if I refuse? Shifeng asked with a calm smile. He then took a step forward. Chapter 2092, Slain in One Hit. Chapter 2092, Slain in One Hit. As Shifeng stepped forward and his calm voice reached the players around him, the experts watching from a distance and the spectating crowd stared with dropped jaws. Even Starlink's sneering ranger froze in shock as Shifeng incredulously approached. Is Black Flame tired of living? The 4 superpowers have only avoided Zero Wing thus far out of respect for Nature Hall and Unyielding Soul. Why would he dare take the initiative to attack them? Has he just given up? None of the major powers experts or upper echelons could understand why Shifeng was being so stubborn. The auction arena had just begun, so there would be plenty of opportunities to secure energy crystals later. Even if the 4 superpowers wanted to monopolize the crystals, they didn't have the manpower to cover every corner of the 5 battlefields. Furthermore, Zero Wing's strength was only second to the 4 superpowers in this auction arena. It definitely had a chance of claiming the energy crystals that the 4 superpowers couldn't secure. Zero Wing didn't actually need to fight these superpowers. While the crowd chatted about the situation among themselves, the purple-clad woman's expression darkened. Black Flame. Do you really think that we are too afraid to attack just because you have Nature Hall and Unyielding Soul's support? The woman from King's Return demanded frostily. With her wrath, the surrounding space froze. Her aura was no less intense than Tengu's. The ambient mana rampaged in tandem with the woman's anger. The players within this violent mana storm began to lose their temper as well. The various major powers experts gasped as they felt the sudden change. Even Melody, who experienced the altered environment from her spectator room, paled. How is she so powerful? A simple mood change has affected the surrounding mana so drastically. Melody watched the purple-clad beauty with a grim expression. As a half-elf, she had a very high affinity with elemental mana. Even so, she couldn't easily trigger mana without casting a spell, yet this purple-clad woman could. While this feat might not seem impressive, Melody recognized how frightening it truly was and what it represented as a magical class expert. When casting a spell, a player uses incantations and runes to trigger the ambient mana and gather it to a single point. Only then could a caster use the gathered mana to form the necessary magic arrays. If one could command the mana around them without incantations or runes, they could cast a spell in a fraction of the normally required time. In God's Domain, magical class players' glaring weaknesses were their casting times and mana capacity. If a magical class player could reduce their casting time, they could substantially increase their combat power, especially against other players. This was especially true when it came to combat against players. This is only natural. She is, after all, King's Return's favored prodigy, Wilting Netherworld. She has also earned the nickname Lightning Witch. Purely comparing battle records, she's even more impressive than the Warring Ghost. If not for King's Return hadn't come to an agreement with the Secret Pavilion, Wilting Netherworld would have long since ranked among the top 50 players on the God's Domain experts list, Evil Judgment said as he watched the purple-clad woman in fascination. Now that Black Flame has angered Wilting Netherworld, she and Tengu are more than enough to disqualify every Zero Wing member on Battlefield number 1. Very few people knew of Wilting Netherworld's battle records. Most likely, only the various superpowers knew about her. Furthermore, Wilting Netherworld's activities were usually only related to the various superpowers. First-rate guilds experts had no chance of encountering her. Evil Judgment had witnessed Wilting Netherworld's fearsome power personally. A total of 8 superpowers had gathered to contest for a mysterious legacy. Setting Sun had been one of them. To win the mysterious legacy, the various superpowers had dispatched quite a few old monsters, but during the battle, an unknown woman had pinned down one of Setting Sun's old monsters by herself, which had ultimately enabled King's Return to claim the legacy. Superpow's old monsters had risen to fame at least a decade ago, with some maintaining their fame for several decades. They were all experts with rich combat experience, and their combat standards far exceeded human limits. However, Wilting Netherworld, a girl even younger than Evil Judgment, had successfully pinned one of these old monsters down without any help. Moreover, she had stopped Evil Judgment, who had fought alongside his guild's old monsters for some time, while doing so. Her strength was absurd. Evil Judgment was sure that she would have killed him in 3 or 4 attacks if that old monster from his guild hadn't demanded most of Wilting Netherworld's attention during that fight. Meanwhile, the 4 superpowers experts around the energy crystal turned to watch Shifeng. Everyone knew of Black Flame's reputation for being stubborn. Otherwise, the man wouldn't have provoked so many superpowers. But they had never thought that he'd dare to show such arrogance before 4 cooperating superpowers. Brother Mu, Vice Guild Leader Thunder, you cannot blame us for our lack of respect toward you. This kid simply doesn't know what's good for him. If we don't teach him a lesson, I'm afraid that he'll cause even more trouble for your 2 guilds in the future, Blind Man said as he turned to Mu Cheng and Deep Thunder. Ha! Do whatever you want. Mu Cheng watched Shifeng with disappointment, thinking the boy was too stubborn and beyond salvation. Only he and Deep Thunder were in this location, but against the combined might of 4 superpowers, they wouldn't accomplish anything even if they had their guild's main force members. None of the 4 superpowers were any weaker than Unyielding Soul or Nature Hall. Hence, neither he nor Deep Thunder had the strength to break these 4 superpowers' rules. Wait! Deep Thunder shouted suddenly. This is Zero Wing's home turf. Isn't it a little much to shove the guild out of this contest? Furthermore, Zero Wing is one of Nature Hall's firm allies. Nature Hall can't just sit by and watch you bully Zero Wing. Deep Thunder's abrupt attitude change stunned the various superpowers members. They couldn't fathom what trick he was trying to pull. Since when were Zero Wing and Nature Hall firm allies? To add to their confusion, Deep Thunder seemed intent on fighting alongside Zero Wing. The situation even confused Mu Cheng. He hadn't expected Deep Thunder to be so committed to helping Zero Wing. Vice Guild Leader Thunder is so affectionate. Unfortunately, Zero Wing has already enraged Starlink's members. I'm afraid that it's too late to stop them, an old man from Starlink wearing silvery-grey leather armor said as he glanced at Tengu, who had already begun to move. With a smile, he continued, moreover, rules are rules. If we superpowers don't show off our power, no one will fear or respect us. Everyone nodded in agreement with this old man's sentiments. They all felt that Deep Thunder was being too foolish. Even in such a desperate situation, he still insisted on protecting Zero Wing. Did he really think that their superpowers feared Nature Hall? While the superpowers members expressed their agreement, Tengu arrived before Shifeng, his great sword blazing with fire. With a swing, his 20-meter-long flaming blade descended on Shifeng. Die! The surrounding temperature rose due to the raging flames, and everyone within range felt the increasing gravitational force pulling them toward the ground, making movement difficult. Tier 2 Taboo Skill, Inferno Blade. Even the various superpowers experts wore grim expressions as they watched Tengu's display of power. They hadn't expected the warring ghost to wield such strength after restoring his equipment's ranks. This attack definitely had the strength to rival a Grand Lord's of the same level. Even a peak Tier 2 metric tons would likely struggle to block this attack, much less a Tier 2 swordsman. Without a Berserk skill, Shifeng's HP would likely drop to a critical level after a single hit. Just before the flaming blade devoured Shifeng, he unsheathed Killing Ray and swung to intercept the attack. Lightning Slash. An arch of blue lightning flashed, and Tengu's flaming blade dissipated the moment it met the lightning arch. Before Tengu could pull back to defend himself, the lightning had bisected his body, leaving behind a faint, glowing scar around his abdomen. Tengu's HP instantly drained, and the berserker fell, lifeless. Chapter 2093, Imposing Might. Chapter 2093, Imposing Might. This. Impossible. Tengu spun toward Shifeng in shock when he saw his plummeting HP. Inferno Blade was his most powerful skill. Even without a Berserker skill, he could use this taboo skill to counter a Grand Lord's attack. With his ability to predict his opponent's movements, even old monsters would have to flee from this attack. However, Shifeng had shattered his Inferno Blade and killed him with the same move. But that wasn't the worst part. Tengu's failure to predict Shifeng's movements truly surprised him. He could even foresee Domain Realm monsters' movements, yet this ability was useless against Shifeng. Although Tengu wanted to warn his companions, his HP had already hit 0, and he lost control of his body. As Tengu collapsed to the ground, the killing intent that had filled the battlefield froze as the 4 superpowers experts stared at Shifeng, silently panicking. It was one thing if Shifeng had killed an ordinary peak expert, but Tengu wasn't an ordinary anything. He was even capable of threatening old monsters. Yet, Shifeng had instant killed such an expert no matter how they looked at it. This felt like a dream. God's Domain certainly had powerful offensive skills that could instant kill players, and knowing this, every peak expert had equally powerful life-saving skills to avoid such an outcome. Needless to say, an expert like Tengu had amassed a few of these life-saving skills. However, Tengu hadn't had time to activate his life-saving skills before dying. Shifeng's attack had even nullified Tengu's prided Inferno blade before the warring ghost had taken the hit. Silence reigned over the crowd outside of the battlefield, their jaws dropping as the implications of Shifeng's attack sunk in. Amazing. He killed a superpowers peak expert in one hit. So, that is the Sword King, Black Flame? Everyone watching knew the nickname Sword King, but they had only heard about him through rumors. Moreover, God's Domain had been developing rapidly, and players' combat standards continued to improve. Black Flame's previous battle records no longer meant much to current players. The players that had come from other kingdoms and empires, in particular, didn't think much of Black Flame's title. At least, it was far less imposing than the position of Zero Wing's guild leader. However, this scene reminded them of how fearsome the Sword King truly was. The Sword King had certainly grown stronger since receiving the title, not weaker. While the spectators discussed the fight, Shifeng sheathed Killing Ray. He then glanced at wilting Netherworld and her companions, asking, "Do you still want to stop me?" Shifeng's voice sounded calm and gentle, yet wilting Netherworld and the other experts felt an immense pressure weigh them down. These experts unconsciously moved out for the way. Seeing that his opponents had lost the will to fight, Shifeng and his teammates continued toward the energy crystal. Wilting Netherworld and her comrades didn't attempt any sneak attacks, merely watching, frustrated, from the sidelines. They merely looked on with frustration from the sidelines. Wilting Netherworld felt particularly bitter. Although she considered stopping Shifeng, the moment she harbored the thought, she felt an indifferent gaze directed toward her, informing her that he was prepared for such an attack. When she met Shifeng's cold gaze, she felt as if the man were telling her, "You can try it, but you'll only fall next to Tengu." With this realization, wilting Netherworld abandoned any thoughts of resisting. Her strength was, at best, a match for Tengu's. Even though Shifeng had already used his Surekill skill, killing her wouldn't be difficult for someone with even higher attributes than Tengu and Domain Realm combat standards. Is this why he was so confident? When wilting Netherworld thought back to Shifeng's relaxed attitude, she understood that he hadn't acted that way due to nature Hall and unyielding soul's support. He simply had the strength to back up his confidence. What? They got through, just like that. As the various major powers experts watched wilting Netherworld and her comrades let Shifeng's party pass, they were flabbergasted. By killing just one player, Shifeng had silenced the 4 superpowers peak experts, convincing them that it would be wise to let him pass. This was even more shocking than watching someone kill a great lord with one attack. When Melody saw this from her spectator room, however, she was incomparably excited. She had never dreamed that Shifeng would be so powerful. Not only had he killed a monster like Tengu, but wilting Netherworld and her party were also afraid enough that they stepped aside. How? How is this possible? Evil Judgment, on the other hand, was stupefied, confusion and madness flashing in his eyes. Wilting Netherworld, a goddess in his eyes, had retreated from Shifeng. She hadn't even budged during the fight with his guild's old monster, yet a single sentence from Shifeng had been enough to force her aside. Evil Judgment even wondered if the world was playing some cruel joke on him. Back on the battlefield, the 4 superpowers members that were waiting for the descending energy crystal to reach the ground tensed at this unexpected result. How surprising. Even Black Flame has reached this standard. It's no wonder why he dared to participate, Blind Man said as he began to watch Shifeng more seriously. Glancing at Mu Cheng and Deep Thunder, he realized why their guilds wanted to befriend Zero Wing. Based on the information King's Return had collected, Shifeng's combat standards were only at the Void Realm, yet he could display combat power that rivaled Domain Realm experts. He mainly relied on his powerful basic attributes and skills to face Domain Realm experts. However, things had changed. Although Shifeng had only executed one attack, his control assured Blind Man that Shifeng had reached the Domain Realm. Every Domain Realm expert warranted the various superpowers' attention, let alone a Domain Realm expert with the support of a large guild. As time passed, this Domain Realm expert would only become more powerful. Any Domain Realm expert intent on causing trouble could give the various superpowers a massive headache. This situation reminded Blind Man of the 4 shadow demons from the past. However, Mu Cheng didn't know that Shifeng had reached the domain realm. He was actually surprised to see Shifeng display such power. This revelation would certainly affect the competition. Meanwhile, Jing Yang, one of Blackwater's upper echelons, currently wore a dark expression. Brother Jing, Zero Wing is stronger than we expected. We'll likely find it difficult to execute our original plan, Snowscar whispered to Jing Yang. A domain realm expert wasn't an easy opponent. At the very least, it meant that Zero Wing qualified to compete for the energy crystals in Battlefield Number 1. It's true that Black Flame is stronger than we suspected, but slaying Tengu will cause Zero Wing some trouble, Jing Yang said as he watched Starlink's members approach Shifeng. Smiling, he continued, it seems Starlink can no longer sit still. Of the 5 battlefields in this competition, Battlefield Number 1 was a gathering of monsters. 2 of Starlink's most powerful combatants had been assigned to the battlefield, Wind Demon and Sword Demon of the 4 Shadow Demons. As Jing Yang finished his comment, both Wind Demon and Shadow Demon had reached Shifeng. The 2 elderly men smiled at their opponent as if they were just 2 friendly old men from the neighborhood instead of the combat veterans they truly were. These old men's auras were nothing like Tengu's. Their auras felt like the vast ocean, and everyone felt like small boats waiting to be devoured by the waves as these auras washed over them. Even wilting Netherworld was afraid as she looked at these 2 men. Not only did Wind Demon and Sword Demon carry 4 pieces of epic equipment, but they also wielded epic weapons. The rest of their equipment was level 65 Dark Gold rank. Not even wilting Netherworld's equipment was as impressive as theirs. Little brother, you're quite skilled. You're already so strong despite your age. Your future is boundless. Our guild leader wants to annihilate Zero Wing, but after discussing the situation with Old Wind here, we've decided that if Zero Wing agrees to become one of Starlink's subordinate guilds, we'll talk the guild leader into giving you White River City, the white-haired old man with a slightly bent back addressed Shifeng. Smiling, he asked, may I know what you think of this proposal? Everyone was dumbfounded when they heard the old man's words, especially the various major powers' upper echelons. They all stared at Shifeng in envy. No one had considered that not only would Starlink willingly abandon its vengeance against Zero Wing, but it would also offer to protect the guild. If the smaller guild accepted the offer, Zero Wing's development in God's domain would skyrocket. There's nothing to think about. Scram. Shifeng's response was cold as he eyed Wind Demon and Sword Demon. Chapter 2094, With Just You? Chapter 2094, With Just You? Sword Demon's expression sunk when he heard Shifeng's reply, his smile vanishing as he gave Zero Wing's swordsman a chilling look. Even space around them frozen due to the bone-piercing killing intent Sword Demon. Wilting Netherworld, who stood nearby, couldn't help but shudder as she felt the change. The experts from the various major powers just stared at Shifeng, gaping in shock. Has Black Flame really lost his mind? Doomed. Zero Wing is doomed for sure. The various major powers didn't know what to say to Shifeng's overbearing behavior. Starlink already suppressed 2 super first-rate guilds in the Dark Knight Empire. It had endless strength and wasn't a force that super first-rate guilds like Unyielding Soul or Nature Hall could compare to. Only top-ranked super first-rate guilds had any hope of standing against it. If Starlink gave the word, countless powers would do what they could to curry its favor and celebrate becoming Starlink's subordinate guild. As one of Starlink's subordinate guilds, not only would the guild receive financial support from the superpower, but it would also receive support in in-game resources. Most importantly, the guild could develop without worrying about enemies. It would have nothing to fear even when clashing with other superpowers. If Zero Wing submitted to Starlink, it could reach an entirely new level of development very quickly. Zero Wing wouldn't be limited to lording over Starmoon Kingdom. It could easily become the overlord in the several neighboring kingdoms as well. Yet, Shifeng had actually rejected such an opportunity, and he had done so without hesitation. Even the various superpowers players were stunned by his answer. Young people nowadays really are ignorant of their limitations, Blind Man said as he shook his head and chuckled. He then turned to Deep Thunder and said, Vice Guild Leader Thunder, although you have a good relationship with Zero Wing, I'd advise you not to interfere. If you attract the 4 Shadow Demon Sire, you'll likely have a hard time explaining yourself to Guild Leader Nature. Not even he would dare to show such arrogance before Sword Demon and Wind Demon. First of all, they had Starlink's support. Secondly, both experts were incredibly powerful, far stronger than the younger generation's Domain Realm experts. Ignoring Starlink, provoking these two was not wise. Thank you for your concern, but King's Return doesn't need to worry about that, Deep Thunder replied. Calmly, he continued, I've said this already, but Nature Hall and Zero Wing are firm allies. If someone wants to move against Zero Wing, Nature Hall won't sit back and watch. Blind Man gave the younger expert an odd look, but he didn't comment further. The various Superpowers members standing nearby were stunned by Deep Thunder's reply. Even now, Nature Hall insisted on shielding Zero Wing. The guild's choices were completely out of the norm. Deep Thunder's response even surprised Mu Cheng, and he took a moment to consider Shifeng more carefully. He had never thought that Zero Wing was capable of inspiring Nature Hall to go to such great lengths, even willing to provoke Starlink on its behalf. However, despite the strange looks he received from the various Superpowers members, Deep Thunder smiled contentedly. None of these superpowers, excluding Nature Hall, knew what strength Zero Wing hid. These players didn't know that Shifeng wasn't the only powerhouse in Zero Wing. The guild also had Fire Dance, who had the combat power to rival Domain Realm experts. But that wasn't the end of it. Zero Wing also had Kola and the several other peak experts Shifeng had brought with him during his visit to Nature Hall's reception room. According to Nature Hall's initial estimations, Zero Wing should have at least 10 peak experts. Even though Starlink had dispatched a considerable amount of strength to White River City's auction house, its chances of winning this competition weren't overwhelmingly high. Rather, it only had a 50-50 chance. Zero Wing had invested every resource it had in White River City, and every participating Zero Wing player had likely fully restored all of their weapons and equipment, allowing them to fight in peak condition. However, the same couldn't be said for Starlink's members. Only a fraction of Starlink's force had unbound all of their equipment. Even though Starlink had the numerical advantage, Zero Wing's overall combat power was on par with the superpowers. Rather than side with the 4 superpowers and standing to gain insignificant benefits, gambling on Zero Wing and potentially winning the lottery was a wiser move for Nature Hall. Old Sword, it seems this brat doesn't appreciate your goodwill. Wind Demon could not help but chuckle at Sword Demon. There's no need to waste words on them, Elder Sword. Let's just follow the guild leader's orders and eliminate them, a middle-aged man wielding an ancient, crystal bow said as he glared at Shifeng. Sword Demon was the strongest of the 4 shadow demons in melee combat. Even Lu Xingluo, Starlink's guild leader, had to treat him with respect. Sword Demon also had a great appreciation for talented individuals, especially those that used the sword. Of course, the main reason for his appreciation was his desire for strong opponents in the future. To grow stronger, one needed to face stronger combatants, after all. This was also why Sword Demon had suggested recruiting Zero Wing. Otherwise, Sword Demon would have killed Shifeng after watching the swordsman kill Tengu. Little brat, it seems that you think you can ignore us old fellows now that you've reached the Domain Realm. Unfortunately, you are still naive. Since you aren't backed by a superpower, you've failed to understand that reaching the Domain Realm is only the first step toward the apex, Sword Demon said as he heaved a deep sigh. His gaze then sharpened as he said, I will teach you that even among Domain Realm experts, there can be a massive difference in strength. Sword Demon's aura abruptly shifted, releasing a tremendous amount of pressure to bear down on Shifeng. Although Sword Demon's aura targeted Shifeng, wilting Netherworld couldn't help but tremble, struggling to breathe, even though she stood some distance behind Shifeng. How is he so strong? Fire Dance, Alluring Summer, Flying Shadow, and Shadow Sword prepared for battle from behind Shifeng. They had never expected this player's aura to be so strong. Before anyone could react, Sword Demon's Crimson Greatsword transformed into a rotating sword light. He then vanished, reappearing before Shifeng in an instant. Like nimble snakes, 12 crimson sword lights spread out and converged on Shifeng, altering their attack trajectories and becoming nearly impossible to predict. Moreover, the attacks were so fast that the naked eye couldn't keep up. Tier 2 skill, 12 heavenly rotations. Sure enough, he's reached this level after so long. Blindman's expression tensed when he saw the 12 sword lights. Wilting Netherworld, on the other hand, was utterly dumbfounded. Despite her keen perception, she couldn't follow the 12 sword lights' speed and transformations. It looked as if 12 different people commanded the sword lights, like each attack had a will of its own. The 12 sword lights didn't even interfere with each other's trajectories. Although each attack only carried a great lord's strength of the same level, she doubted that she'd be able to dodge or block this assault. An ordinary skill like 12 heavenly rotations had gained a life of its own in Sword Demon's hands. His combat standards were unlike anything she had seen from the domain realm experts she had fought before. Alone. I'm afraid you're not qualified. With a snort, Shifeng unsheathed Killing Ray and Twilight Blade, greeting the 12 sword lights in battle. Swords Transmigration. Chapter 2095, So Confident with So Many Fighters. Chapter 2095, So Confident with So Many Fighters. As the 12 crimson sword lights were about to bite into Shifeng, Killing Ray and Twilight Blade cut 6 of them down. The counterattack forcibly altered these sword lights' trajectories, and rather than threatening Shifeng's life, they became shields that protected him as they clashed with the remaining 6 sword lights. Dang! 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 As the 12 sword lights collided, they disintegrated into particles of light. Meanwhile, Shifeng remained unharmed. He blocked all of those attacks. Wilting Netherworld stared at the fading light particles with wide eyes. Sword Demon's use of this skill had reached the peak of God's domain. She was sure that even King's Return's old monsters would be forced to use a life-saving skill or powerful offensive skill to nullify the attack, yet Shifeng had done so with a few simple slashes. Moreover, Shifeng had neutralized the attack so effortlessly. Wilting Netherworld couldn't believe her eyes. Similarly, the various major powers watching experts gaped at the scene. Amazing. This is simply amazing. So, this is an apex expert's strength. Shock and excitement overwhelmed everyone after witnessing the brief clash between Shifeng and Sword Demon. Although they all knew that the various superpowers old monsters were extraordinarily power, they had never seen one in action before. At most, they had watched a few of those old monsters' battle videos. However, they now watched one of these old monsters fight an equally strong opponent. Moreover, they only stood 200 yards away from the fight. For Tier 2 players, watching from this distance was like watching a fight from 50 yards away for Tier 1 players. Black Flame really can't be underestimated. No wonder why he dismissed Sword Demon's offer so quickly. Blind Man was also slightly surprised to see Shifeng unharmed. At Sword Demon's skill level, one could command their skills or spells as if they were subordinates, using them in such a way that they were beyond 100% effective. Ordinary domain realm experts had no hope against Sword Demon. After all, experts that had just reached the domain realm could only use their skills and spells at 100% efficiency. There was a qualitative difference between the two. While everyone discussed Sword Demon and Shifeng's initial exchange, Shifeng moved, appearing before Sword Demon instantly. Killing Ray and Twilight Blade then transformed into countless sword lights as they assaulted the older man. Sword's Orbit. Before Shifeng had reached the domain realm, he had mainly used Sword's Orbit for defense since using the technique offensively had dealt so little damage. He had only been able to execute 6 simultaneous attacks with the technique, but after reaching the domain realm, he could perform Sword's Orbit perfectly. Not only was the technique powerful when used defensively, but it was also quite strong offensively. Sword Demon's expression darkened as the sword lights flew toward him. He couldn't actually perceive the attack trajectories, and he felt as if the entire world pressed down on him. He could also sense that each sword light had enough power to slice apart space itself. Shifeng's attacks were even stronger than a great lord's of the same level. In the blink of an eye, oval 4 sword lights sliced at him from different directions. Break! Sword Demon shouted, and the flames along his great sword transformed into a streak of light as they countered more than half of the incoming attacks. He then left behind multiple afterimages as he dodged the remaining attacks. He elusive thrust his greatsword at Shifeng, his attack carrying as much strength as a Grand Lord of the same level. However, Shifeng's sword orbit was normally a defensive combat technique. Although Sword Demon's attacks were stronger this time and stronger than Shifeng's, the galaxy of stars that surrounded the younger swordsman deflected every strike. None of Sword Demon's attacks touched Shifeng. For a time, Sword Demon and Shifeng continued to trade attacks, their HPs falling bit by bit. Neither swordsman was able to secure an advantage over the other. Very few of the watching experts nearby could keep up with Sword Demon's elusive attacks and movement techniques. When these experts tried to put themselves in Shifeng's position, they realized that Sword Demon would easily slaughter them. As for Shifeng's combat technique, he was so fast that they couldn't register his movements. They had only realized that he had swung his sword after the fact. When they imagined being on the receiving end of his attacks, they recognized that they wouldn't block a single swing and would be slaughtered helplessly. Amazing. Melody could not believe her eyes as she watched the exchange between Shifeng and Sword Demon, excitement welling within her heart. Even the various superpowers feared Sword Demon, and he currently carried 6 epic weapons and equipment pieces. His equipment standards undoubtedly ranked among the very top in God's domain right now. Yet, Shifeng fought Sword Demon to a standstill. So, this is his true strength. Mu Cheng, who watched the battle from the battlefield, was just as shocked as Shifeng held this play out from the side. Blind Man said calmly. Damned blind man. Mu Cheng inwardly cursed. Watching from the sidelines and staying its hand was the best option for King's return. It wasn't from the Dark Knight Empire, and it had no reason to clash with Starlink. However, King's return would prefer to watch Starlink grow stronger, rather than Zero Wing, which would indirectly help Unyielding Soul. If Starlink succeeded, it could keep both Unyielding Soul and Crimson Emperor in check, after all. As for Zero Wing's other members and Deep Thunder, they were no threat to Starlink's 2 old monsters. While Sword Demon and Shifeng fought, a black figure appeared behind the younger swordsman. It was none other than Wind Demon. The assassin expert split into 9 shadows that attacked Shifeng in silence. Meanwhile, Sword Demon created 4 copies of his greatsword, sending innumerable sword lights to devour Shifeng. Facing simultaneous attacks from the 2 old monsters, not even Shifeng could defend himself. He immediately activated Void Shield to block the incoming attacks. A single round of attacks was enough to deplete 1/6 of the Void Shield's energy reserves. These attacks' power could easily rival that of Grand Lords of the same level. What a powerful life-saving skill. Wind Demon was slightly surprised to see the magic barrier that had appeared around Shifeng. Unfortunately, that won't save you. With Old Sword and I working together, you have no chance of winning this fight. You're not wrong, but that would require that you two can cooperate, Shifeng calmly replied, glancing at Wind Demon. You still have such confidence even in the face of death. Wind Demon could not help but laugh at Shifeng. However, Wind Demon's laughter stopped abruptly as his expression changed, and he activated his life-saving skill, Wind Steps. Without warning, a crimson figure had appeared beside the old assassin, thrusting a short sword toward Wind Demon's heart. However, Wind Demon reacted quickly enough that he could use the brief invulnerability Wind Steps provided to protect himself. But the moment Wind Demon lost his invulnerability status, the crimson figure stabbed at him again. This time, the old monster met the attack with one of his own daggers. Boom! Wind Demon's arm went numb as he was thrown several yards back, crashing to the ground. His dagger hummed as it vibrated from the impact. Who are you? Wind Demon demanded, addressing the crimson figure with a serious expression. Do you the outcome that awaits any who attack me? An assassin's strength had proven greater than his, and his assailant's attack speed was superior, as well. Once he got a better look at his newest opponent, Wind Demon was stunned. What the? Wind Demon wasn't the only player surprised to see this crimson figure. Everyone on the battlefield was stupefied. This crimson figure, which had surprised a superpower's old monster, was none other than Zero Wing's fire dance. Everyone on the battlefield erupted in an uproar. Nobody had expected Zero Wing to reveal another such trump card. This turn of events even surprised Mu Cheng. Black Flame. I hadn't thought that your guild had hidden such an expert. However, do you think that you can defeat Starlink just because you have someone to pin down Old Wind? Sword Demon asked as he glanced at Fire Dance. Suddenly, 12 Starlink members moved to surround Shifeng. Although Fire Dance's combat power was unexpected, Zero Wing's party was still outnumbered. Moreover, 4 of Starlink's 12 members were peak experts. Do you think you're powerful just because you have more people? Shifeng countered, eyeing Starlink's players around him. He then activated Twilight's Shadow and Twilight of the Gods. Suddenly, 8 copies of Shifeng joined the battlefield, every one of these doppelgangers radiating an intensely frightening aura that was no weaker than Shifeng's. Alright, let the second round begin. Chapter 2096, Vicious Black Flame. Chapter 2096, Vicious Black Flame. The confident Starlink's members had displayed vanished as Shifeng's 8 doppelgangers joined the fray. At the same time, fear surfaced in their eyes as Starlink's members looked at Shifeng's doppelgangers. The nearby spectators' eyes nearly fell from their sockets when they saw this. Crap. Is this real? Cheating. He is definitely cheating. Many experts watching from a distance couldn't help but shout in indignation. The Zero Wing members watching from outside of the battlefield, however, began to cheer. All hail the guild leader. Zero Wing for the win. No one had held a favorable view of Zero Wing when this competition had begun. Some had even been certain that Zero Wing would perish after this, and everyone had mocked the guild. Now, however, would anyone dare question Zero Wing's superiority? A special doppelganger skill? Sword Demon's expression twisted as he observed Shifeng's doppelgangers. He had already struggled against Shifeng alone. After all, the younger swordsman's basic attributes were higher than his. If not for the significant strength and speed boost his special weapon provided, Shifeng would have already defeated him. Yet, now, he had to face 9 identical copies of this troublesome swordsman. He might not have been worried if these copes had been ordinary doppelgangers. If that were the case, their basic attributes would be far lower than the originals. At most, these doppelgangers might have slowed him down a little, which would be annoying, but from what Sword Demon could sense, these doppelgangers' attributes rivaled his own. Sword Demon felt an intense pressure from each clone, which meant that Shifeng had just gained 8 more monster-level experts. Of course, this was the best-case scenario for Shifeng. If Sword Demon actually continued this fight, it would be a different story. After all, everyone's attention span was limited. Even if Shifeng were a domain realm expert, he couldn't perfectly control all 8 doppelgangers and fight. Controlling a doppelganger was far more complex than controlling one's body. Controlling a single doppelganger perfectly was the limit for a domain realm expert. Controlling more would affect the doppelganger's performance. However, even if Shifeng couldn't control all 8 doppelgangers perfectly, he shouldn't have a problem exhibiting flowing water realm combat standards with them. With his ridiculously high basic attributes, each of his doppelgangers could face a peak expert of the same level. In other words, Zero Wing's party had suddenly gained another 8 peak experts. Unfortunately, Starlink only had a total of 5 peak experts on battlefield number 1, and the strongest of them, Tengu, had already been killed. This left Starlink with only 4 peak experts, and the remaining members were only Refinement Realm and Flowing Water Realm experts. Overall, Starlink was now at a massive disadvantage. Even Wind Demon gulped nervously as he watched Shifeng. Who is this kid? Wind Demon wondered as he stared at the young swordsman in confusion. Not only had Shifeng successfully reached the domain realm at such a young age, but he had also amassed absurdly high basic attributes. Now, he had revealed a doppelganger skill that defied common sense. No matter how Wind Demon considered the situation, he couldn't believe it. No individual player could easily obtain Shifeng's weapons, equipment, or skills. Acquiring any of these required an astronomical amount of resources and manpower. The 4 shadow demons had only even secured their current weapons, equipment, and skills thanks to Starlink's help. However, Shifeng had collected such items by relying on a guild that only controlled one kingdom. Amazing. With this, Starlink is finished in battlefield number 1. Mu Cheng balled his fists in delight as he glanced at Blind Man. He had been worried for Zero Wing, and if not for Blindman's interference, he would have jumped into this battle to help the guild. However, Blindman's efforts had gone to waste with this new development. Just as Shifeng was about to attack Starlink's members, a low voice reached his ears. Guild leader Black Flame, don't be so quick to act. Blackwater's Jing Yang called out. You've already proven Zero Wing's strength. I doubt anyone will continue to oppose Zero Wing's participation in this competition for energy crystals, so do you need to exterminate them all? What are you trying to say? Shifeng asked as he eyed Jing Yang, who wore aqua-blue robes and carried a glowing, golden staff. Jing Yang had made no effort to hide his equipment's glowing effects, so Shifeng knew that the man carried 4 pieces of epic equipment in total. Although Shifeng couldn't discern what rank Jing Yang's staff was, he guessed that it was at least epic rank based on its aura. Moreover, Jing Yang wore a complete level 65 fine gold set equipment, which even the various superpowers struggled to collect. Level 65 fine gold set equipment was far more difficult to acquire than level 60 dark gold set equipment at this stage of the game. Not even Starlink had a complete set. Naturally, a level 65 fine gold set had even higher basic attribute bonuses than level 60 dark gold set equipment. The mana fluctuations around Jing Yang were even stronger than those around Wilting Netherworld, and his combat standards were likely stronger than hers. He had reached the Void Realm more than a decade ago, and although Wilting Netherworld was a prodigy, she would need more time before she could catch up to Jing Yang. Starlink only acted in compliance with the rules our superpowers agreed to. If guild leader Black Flame is earnest in moving against Starlink, the rest of us won't just sit back and watch. I hope you can understand this, Jing Yang said, smiling. Jing Yang's words left everyone stunned. They had never expected this battle to take such a drastic turn. Blackwater is too shameless. It didn't step forward when Starlink was about to annihilate Zero Wing, but now that Zero Wing has the upper hand, it wants to interfere. Since when have Blackwater and Starlink had such a good relationship? Zero Wing is in trouble now. Such a powerful doppelganger skill definitely has a very long cooldown. If Zero Wing misses this opportunity to take out Starlink, it isn't likely that the guild will find another chance. Zero Wing is so unlucky. If it hadn't provoked Blackwater, the guild likely wouldn't have interfered today. For a time, the various major powers either pitied or mocked Zero Wing's situation. Melody, I advise that you give up any hope for Zero Wing. Zero Wing might have the strength to resist a superpower, but it has provoked too many. Zero Wing can't survive in God's domain for long. This situation is the best proof. Just before Zero Wing emerges victorious in this fight, Blackwater steps in. Zero Wing has no chance of winning White River City's auction house, Evil Judgment said, chuckling when he saw Melody's enraged expression. Blackwater was no weaker than Starlink, and although it hadn't sent as many experts to this competition, it had nearly as many experts fighting for the auction house as Starlink. Including Jing Yang, Blackwater had 4 peak experts and 7 refinement realm and flowing water realm experts on battlefield number 1. In addition, the guild had the domain realm expert, South Time, the man standing behind Jing Yang. Although South Time had only recently reached the domain realm, he was still a monster-level expert. His participation would be more than enough to turn the tides of the battle between Starlink and Zero Wing. If Zero Wing missed this opportunity to eliminate Starlink's members, it wouldn't encounter another. Regardless of what Shifeng decided, Zero Wing was guaranteed to lose White River City. Understand? Shifeng could not help but laugh. You think you qualify to stop me? Suddenly, Shifeng vanished. Before anyone could react, he reappeared before Jing Yang, his killing ray releasing a brilliant blue glow. Tier 2 taboo skill, Instant Strike. A streak of blue light flew toward Jing Yang's throat, and the man panicked at the sudden attack. Shifeng's attack was so fast that he didn't even have time to activate Blink. Just before the blue light bit into the man, his golden staff released a golden light, instantly creating a barrier of light around Jing Yang. Seeing this barrier, Jing Yang could not help but breathe out a sigh of relief. The passive skill, 3 Pillars Barrier, had created this light barrier. The ability triggered automatically when its wielder faced a lethal attack. When activated, the skill created a magic barrier that negated 90% of all attacks damage for 3 seconds. It also increased his defense by 300%, raising his defense to rival an MT's of the same level. It was an amazing life-saving skill that had a 1-hour cooldown, and with it, even Grand Lords would struggle to kill him. However, the moment after Jing Yang's side, Shi Feng's attack struck. The light barrier cracked, and Jing Yang instantly lost 1/3 of his HP. The man paled with fright. Although he immediately tried to escape by using Blink, Shi Feng's Twilight Blade had already begun its descent. When the second slash landed, Jing Yang's HP dropped to 0 in an instant without the protection of the 3 pillars barrier. His body only teleported 20 yards away after Jing Yang's vision began to darken. He then collapsed and disintegrated into countless particles of light. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.